I don't have much time, and I don't have many friends I could call mine. And I've been deceived, yeah, but haven't we all? I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall. Well, I don't know why, and I don't know where, and I don't even know how, and I no longer care. But I've seen your face, and I've heard your call. Yes, I've seen the sun rise, and I've seen the sun fall.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. My very special guest today, Steve.
Hello and
oh, hang on, we've got a bit of
SDAQ.
Let's get rid of that bit of feedback there. Let's try that again. My very special guests today are Steve Daly and Tom Norris. Welcome, guys. Great to have you here.
Hello.
Yeah.
We've got a great audience already watching, and I think there's chats and comments even coming through already. That's great to see. Oh, someone said they loved that song. Thank you very much. By the way, that just reminds me, I've got a free song which I'm offering to you guys, especially that have been so supportive of SDAQ&A over the last couple of years. If you go to that address, just peterdixon.gumroad.com, you'll see the song, which is very similar to the one just played. It might even be that song. And just follow the links there, and you can download that for free. So welcome, everybody. Later on, we are going to have a time for asking questions. Feel free to ask them during the program as well. But I guess, you know, if it's a specific question, we're going to be focusing on questions from the audience later on. And we're just going to double check we are going live to YouTube. Yes, going live there. And live to Facebook. We are live there as well, and live in voice today as well. We don't often go live in voice, but I thought I would today because it's such a special and important interview. So welcome, everybody. I've called today's interview, Ellen White is a fraud, yes or no? And I think we're going to have a really interesting chat today, and we're going to unpack simply divergent views and beliefs and ideas. And I'm someone that doesn't mind at all if someone disagrees with me. I usually end up having a really great coffee or lunch with them at a cafe or on a Zoom chat. So we're just really interested in listening to Steve's ideas, to Tom's ideas, and these two guys have quite diverse views when it comes to Ellen White. And Steve has written many works, but particularly of late, his book Ellen G. White, A Psychobiography. And Tom Norris has done a lot of research, Adventist scholar, apologist, and commentator. Both of you guys I've interviewed, Tom once at least, Steve several times. And Tom, I really enjoyed our interview ages back. It was fascinating what you uncovered in the vault there was it with Bert Holoviak?
Bert
Holoviak, yeah. And that was a fascinating interview. So I encourage people to go back and search on the group there for that interview and for Steve Daly and my interviews as well. So I thought we'd kick off, Tom, with basically you sharing some of the things that you would disagree with Steve on, and also state what your kind of position is on that title that I've put up there. Over to you, Tom.
Sure. One of the things that happens here with Ellen White is you have to kind of figure out how to deal with a prophet, a modern day prophet. I don't think any of us here, I don't know about Steve, but have had visions or meaningful dreams. I certainly haven't. Martin Luther said he never wanted to have any dreams or visions. He had enough problems, and while he acknowledged they were real and legitimate, he rejoiced he never had them, because he says the word's enough for me. I don't want to figure out anything else besides that. So it's really weird. I mean, Ellen White is a very unique, different person, and today, we don't know anybody who's got visions or dreams. So we have to kind of be careful and make sure we go back in her time and her period where this was common. In fact, in the little town that Ellen White grew up, I think there was 20,000 people there. There was at least a half a dozen prophets, mostly women, who had dreams and visions, and the whole town knew it. And it was just kind of like you say, this is what happened back then. And one of those people was the young girl, Ellen White. So she wasn't as strange and as, back then as she is today. She fit in much better than that. So that's one point that I think we need to understand. And a second, more important point is there's an idea around that if you have spiritual gifts, you have to be a really straight shooter. You can't make any mistakes. If you make a mistake, well, then that kind of proves that you don't have spiritual gifts. And this is exactly what happened to Canright. I've been writing about Canright. I tried to get a lot more written for this podcast, but I did a lot of research, and I think Liz just sent you the Dropbox or the link. So you post that, you'll see a lot.
I will post that later for sure on the group.
And one thing early on that I found out about Canright, I knew some about him. I've read quite a bit about him. Now I've read a lot more. And Canright, in fact, he officially asked to be disfellowshipped for the fifth and last time he left. He literally did not. He had serious problems with the doctrine, and he also had some conflicts with Ellen White, personal conflicts, which kind of fed into this. And I think we all need to remember, I wasn't that. I didn't realize it that much. D.M. Canright was the son-in-law of James and Ellen White. He married their foster daughter that they raised, and you need to look at that in this light. And it opens a whole new window on their relationship. So they were very anyway. So they got in a fight as a mother-in-law. maybe she didn't think. In fact, she came right out and said that you're not raising your child right. He's crying all the time. You're not paying attention. You're not. You're mean to your wife, her daughter, stepdaughter. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on that had nothing to do with her spiritual gifts, and there was even more than that because him and James White got along pretty good. He and Ellen White didn't. James White really liked Canright. Ellen White did not like Canright, and she let him know that he's not raising the kids right, not treating the wife right. So there's a whole level of tension going on there before we ever get into the big fight between, all the fights in the Seventh-day Adventism renounced and his last book, Ellen White renounced. So that's another point that needs to come into play here. D.M. Canright was Ellen and James White's son-in-law, and Ellen White did not like the way he treated his wife, and I could give you instances of that. But and Ellen White and his wife were much closer than Canright, obviously, because she raised the daughter. So that's another thing that needs to be understood. And perhaps a third most important thing is maybe I said it before, this idea that if you make a mistake or you do something wrong, you can't have spiritual gifts. It gets rid of them. You can't have it. God's not going to give spiritual gifts to someone who goes and robs a bank, or someone who plagiarizes, who takes the words of others and steals them. You can't be a prophet and do that kind of behavior. And at this point, I would just have to say that this is a real problem, and you have to go back into the New Testament to determine how a prophet like Ellen White would be judged. And a lot of people go like, well, okay, how do you do that? And they would say, oh, let's look at Deuteronomy. It says right there, for prophets not telling you the truth, then they're wrong. They're a false prophet. And so they give you that text and say, this is how we judge false prophets. And then, of course, the White estate put together something similar to that called the test of the prophets, how to test a prophet. And one of the first things they say is, if what she says is true, if she's true, then that's a prophet. If she doesn't, so then taking that as the metric for determining credibility, then they spend their whole rest of their lives trying to say that Ellen White never made a mistake. Because if she makes mistakes, gets errors, does things wrong, well, then that just goes against your own test of a prophet, that they don't get things right or they were wrong. And that is just totally 100% false. And so that's the last point I want to say here. And I'll say it in relation to Canright's number one complaint against Ellen White, and Steve Daly's number one complaint against Ellen White, or one of his top, that shut door. One of the first things the critics say about Ellen White, she believed in the shut door. She believed that after the second coming, probation was closed for everyone but the Millerites, or for anyone that didn't accept the second coming. And that lasted for a number of years. Bates was saying that Jesus would come in 7 years, and they had a lot of things going on there. And she definitely was wrong about the probation being closed. And within 4 years or 5 years, they had admitted that, and she had a vision saying there's a door open, and of course the open door was going into the most holy place. And this is really, if you follow all this history through, this is where you get the investigative judgment. It's a spinoff of the error of the shut door. And so, fine, Ellen White made errors, big errors. She's having visions, and she's thinking that this is a true doctrine. Well, guess what? The apostles did the same thing. They had a shut door that was much longer and much worse than the little Millerite group's shut door. And it's very instructive for us, because here's Peter, the head of the church, full of spiritual gifts. In the early church, he's healing people. His shadow, he walks by and his shadow heals people. And the people were just awestruck. Remember, he walked by a poor guy that's, crippled, and the guy says, give me some money. Peter says, I don't have any money, but I'll heal you. So here's Peter, full of spiritual gifts, full of the Holy Spirit, taught by Jesus. He stands up and gives a speech in Passover, and 3,000 people join the church. Another couple of weeks, it's up to 5,000. And on the church goes. Well, guess what? The sermon that he gave had significant doctrinal error in the sermon. The Pentecostal sermon was only given to the Jews. It wasn't given to the Gentiles. In fact, if a Gentile had raised his hand and said, hey, I'm a Gentile, I'm not a Jew, but I want to follow Jesus. I want this gospel. I want to be saved. They would say, this is not for you. We have a shut door. No Gentiles can enter. You're not Israel. The Jewish Messiah is for Jews. So this went on for a number of years, where all the Gentiles were shut out of the church, period. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. And you'll remember, I think it's about Acts 10, Peter has a vision basically saying, you got this all wrong. You have to let the Gentiles in. You have to open the door to the Gentiles. It's the vision of the sheet coming down, and the vision said, eat these, it was unclean things, eat the unclean things. And he's like, Lord, I can't do that. And then finally, it's like, I'm talking about the Gentiles. It's time to let them in the church. You made a big mistake to keep them out for 14 years or what have you. So they had a shut door. And when the door was open, there was trouble. A number of Jewish Christians, Pharisees, did not want the door to be open to the Gentiles. And so they said, look, if you're going to open the door to the Gentiles, they have to be circumcised and become Jews. And then Paul goes nuts and says, that is not how we're going to open the door to the Gentiles. And that's what the book of Galatians is about. The book of Galatians is about the fight that the early church had when they opened their shut door to the Gentiles. So when you look at that history, when you look at the book of Acts, the first 10 chapters, the church the door is shut to Gentiles. There's no one but Jews can enter the church except Jesus as their Savior. The Gentiles were locked out. So now they come back in. There's a big fight. That's what Galatians is about. Now, go to Canwright's books. Go to Steve Daly's books. What do they say? They say, Ellen White can't be a prophet. She can't have real spiritual gifts because she embraced the shut door. What an idiot. Who is she trying to? She's blah, blah, blah. That is total nonsense. This idea that spiritual gifts are dependent upon perfection or semi-perfection or never making a doctrinal mistake or however you want to spin it is absolutely false. And from this theological error comes all the other nonsense about Ellen White, because then what the critics try to do is find errors. And that's what Canwright did. She was wrong about this. The next thing Canwright will say is Ellen White was so stupid and so wrong, she thought Jesus was going to come on October 22nd. And then she thought he was going to come a couple years later. And then she always thought Jesus was around the corner. He's going to come. And therefore, she's wrong because he didn't come. And he still hasn't come. So she can't be a real prophet. She cannot have spiritual gifts. Once again, you look at the early church. What did they think about this topic? Did they, how did they deal with it? Well, all the apostles, Peter, Paul, James, all of them have gone on record saying the second coming is near. It's going to happen any second. We're right at the door. So wait a minute. So why do the apostles get to say, we think Jesus is coming right now? Oh, you were wrong. We think he's coming tomorrow. We're wrong. We think he's coming every day. We're wrong. But yet they can have their spiritual gifts. They can retain whatever level of spiritual gifts they have. But Ellen White can't. She makes the same mistake they make. But yet she is a horrible person. So again, the way we are looking at Ellen White is not biblical. It's not correct. When the disciples asked Jesus, how do we define a true prophet from a false prophet? Does he quote the Torah and Deuteronomy and say, if they're what they say comes true, then that's how you tell? No, that's not what he says. He goes into a big parable about, by their fruits you will know them. You test New Testament prophets by their fruits, not by their perfection, not by their doctrinal correctness. If they don't make any errors, okay. If they do, they're thrown out the door. That's not what Jesus says. So Ellen White has to be tested by her fruits of her life. Now, according to Steve Daly, she should have been in prison and she has no fruits. But when I do my research, before she died, I think she had like 40 sanitariums around the world, dozens of publishing houses, schools, blah, blah, blah. That woman has so much fruit, it's unbelievable. So if you judge her by her fruits, again, Ellen White is not going to have a problem. But if you give her false tests and go, oh, you've got to be perfect, well, she's going to fail. And so would any other prophet, and so would any other human. So that's my opening, thing about Ellen White. We need to understand how a New Testament prophet should be viewed and then apply that same metric to Ellen White. And that's not what Canright has done. And that's not what Steve Daly has done. And furthermore, I should say Steve Daly is really Canright. His book is 90%, maybe 95% of Canright. Almost every point he makes, Canright's already made it. And so Steve Daly has nothing really new to add to the discussion, except he has gone beyond Canright. He's gone beyond Kellogg and claiming that Ellen White is a religious fraud, a con artist, an evil person. Canright never said that about her. Never. In fact, I've just gone through a whole bunch of letters between Ellen White and Canright, and he says, look, you're honest. He says, look, I'll give it to you. You're sincere. You really believe you have visions. You really believe what you say. I don't believe it. I don't believe you have real visions, and that's my opinion, and I'm welcome to it. And why don't you let me have my opinion? And I'm telling you that you're honest. Why can't you tell me I'm honest in my thoughts as well? And Ellen White wouldn't have anything to do with it. It's like, you don't know, you're going down the wrong path, blah, blah, blah. So we really need to clean up some of this nonsense about Ellen White, some of which came from the White estate in the first place. They're the ones that put Ellen White on such a high pedestal that everybody had to say, wow, she can't make any mistakes. She's got to be perfect, or then she'd be a fraud. Should be so they deserve a lot of this nonsense that's happening. But nowadays, with so much information out there, so much knowledge, so many good studies about Ellen White, what she did or didn't do, there's no reason to go off the rails and determine she should have been locked up in jail someplace because she is the worst religious con artist in the world, quote Steve Daly. It's just ludicrous. It's absurd. But it represents Canright, and therefore it's legitimate. What Steve is saying, he represents Canright, and therefore it needs to be said and it needs to be resolved, because Canright was not 100% wrong. Canright had some insights. Canright had some correct understanding. He knew the Sabbath was wrong. He knew that there's something wrong about this Sabbath thing, and he came close to figuring it out, but everything was blowing up and nobody would listen to him, and Wagner was doing his thing. Wagner said, so it really gets into a big theological mess, but that does not mean Canright does not have something to say. And it doesn't mean he wasn't correct about things. He was. And then we can get into that later and all that, but we have to quit getting into this, trying to destroy Ellen White and pretend she didn't do what she did. I mean, Ellen White is an amazing person that more so than I thought. When you see the paper that we just wrote about this, you'll see where Ellen White stands in relation to other writers. I think she's like the third or fourth most translated person in the world. I mean, she really has some statistics that are just unbelievable. Her fruit is good fruit. It's Christian fruit. And based on that, she is legitimate. Does that make her perfect? No. Does that make her whatever she says theologically 100% correct? Not at all. I could sit here and whip off point after point where she's wrong. And I could then show you where she says, hey, look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. The object is to find out what truth is. We all have to go to the Bible. Don't come to me, etc. So anyway, I could go on, but I'll stop at these few points. And they're written in this paper that I guess Steve will get posted up. So anyway, that's just a quick introduction, and
thanks for that, Tom. And I'm going to hand it over to Steve to reply in a moment. And thanks also. Hang on, putting up the wrong things here. People have been writing throughout. I'm just putting up a few things. I'd love to chat, and might be a time. It might be better for another time, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on Joseph Smith, Tom, as he is someone that you could say in schools and churches and hospitals around the world, there's some positive fruits that the Mormon denomination has brought into the world. Would you class him as for people that are believers of him as a prophet?
That's a good question. Jesus told a parable about the tares, and in that parable, the story. There's good fruit, good gospel fruit growing, grain, whatever it was, and then all of a sudden, someone plants tares, and the guy runs over to the master and says, "Should we pull the tares out? Let's rip the tares out so the good grain can grow better, etc." And what does Jesus say? He says, "No. If you pull them out, you're gonna wound a lot of people. You're gonna, so you leave them in until the second coming, and then the second coming at the harvest will separate the tares from the good stuff." If Ellen White is a tare, she's not, but Steve Daly says she is. I stipulate she's a tare. Then Jesus' teaching about her is she's not to be ripped up before the second coming. She's not to be attacked. All right, now we apply that to anybody. It applies to anybody. Joseph Smith, The only question about Joseph Smith, he certainly wasn't a Protestant, but he does talk about Jesus, and he does talk about a gospel, and I'm not sure there's much theology that there might be some truth in there somewhere. So he's a tare. What does Jesus say? Leave him alone. I mean, can you imagine from Jesus' point of view, if he says, "Hey, look, whenever you see somebody teaching something that doesn't fit with us, you attack them, go after them." What kind of, you'd have chaos within the gospel community. So Jesus is doing the opposite. Don't attack anybody. Now Scientology, they're not gospel. Attack them all you want. They would not. They're not a tare. They're not in the gospel field. Joseph Smith is. He claims to be. I call him a tare. I would never try to defend him. Did he have real visions? A lot of people thought he did, but that doesn't mean they were from the good side. They could be from the bad side. So now look at Ellen White. She's a tare. Oh, she's a horrible person. What does Jesus say? Do not attack her. Leave her alone. At the end of the second coming, she'll be judged like everybody else. So when you look at it like that, and I could quote other things from Jesus. There was another group healing in his name, and the disciples said, "Well, but they're not following us. So like, what should we do? Lightning against them?" And Jesus says, "No. Those that are not against us are for us." So no one has a theological right to attack Ellen White, a Protestant, a clear gospel person, a clear church person. Tell her she's a tare, and then attack her. You do that, you are turning your back on Jesus. You're saying, "Jesus, I don't care what you say. I'm doing what I want to do. Let me do it." So what Steve Daly has done is against the gospel. It is against the clear teachings of Jesus, period. I don't care if it's Ellen White. I don't care if it's, some crazy preacher on the TV screen that is nuts and he's got an airplane and all that. Jesus said, leave him alone. He didn't say, don't say they're not a tare. He didn't say, don't identify him as a tare. If you think they're a tare, leave them alone. Steve Daly, you think Ellen White is a con artist, a crook and whatever? Jesus says, leave her alone. He'll take care of it at the judgment. Your job is not to judge Ellen White or anybody else in the gospel field. So that's
Okay.
how that works. Sorry.
So, no, thanks, Tom. Those that are just joining us, what we're doing today is we're looking at Ellen White. Ellen White is a fraud, yes or no? We're not following a classic debate style thing, but I asked Tom to share his point of view on that, to create a bit of his the frame of what he's approaching his beliefs and views from, and where he disagrees with Steve. So I've given Tom a chance to unpack that, and you've done very well at doing that, Tom. Thank you. Steve, over to you to share a little bit about your thoughts on why you might disagree there with Tom, and maybe you took some notes. Over to you, Steve Daly.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you, Tom, for sharing your views. Appreciate you're a little more restrained than sometimes I've heard you in the past. But, I would say that what you just said about wheats and tares evidently doesn't apply to me based on what you were just saying in terms of your condemnation of me. But I would argue
that... It does apply to you. It does apply to you. Of course it does.
But I mean, you were just taking me to...
Tom, we'll give you a chance to have some thoughts on what Steve says as we combine the two in more of a conversation later. So
right.
Back to you,
he was
Steve.
Attacking me after giving the sermon about wheats and tares. But to me, it's an obvious difference between prophets, claimed prophets, professed prophets. Jesus said, beware of false prophets. He said there would be many false prophets in the last days, that we need discernment. We need to be careful and not being deceived by these false prophets. The New Testament's very clear about test the spirits, test the prophets, and hold fast to what is true, what is good. And Ellen White herself asked to be judged. She asked to be investigated. She said that her work could stand up to investigation. My goal is not to put Ellen White on trial. As I say in my book, I've put 326 extensive endnotes in there for each person to explore, examine, and decide for themselves. It's not my position to try to tell people what to think or how to think. I am honest about how I interpret these materials, the source documentation, and the historical evidence. And, that book was written because I ultimately asked the question, will the accusations of fraud and pathology leveled against Ellen throughout her lifetime and after her death, will they stand up to historical and psychological scrutiny? That's really the question I was addressing in the book. I'm not trying to try Ellen White or attack her. I'm simply saying, okay, this is the evidence. I hardly quoted Canwright at all in the book. So to try to say that I'm just echoing Canwright, I think is hardly accurate. If you look at the book itself, I barely mention Canwright. And, speaking of Canwright, the most tragic thing about Canwright is what Arthur White did to him. And I'm involved with writing another book right now about the White estate fraud in that regard. But it's one of the most tragic frauds ever documented, and people are going to be pretty surprised when they see the evidence. But just to, when I talk about Ellen being a fraud, it's not limited to any small amount of evidence. It's lifetime patterns, major lifetime patterns of dishonesty, fraud, plagiarism, attacking people, and all claiming all these things came to her in vision, when it's provable that in many cases they didn't come to her in vision. And when she attacked people, that many of the attacks that she made were proven to be false. Just like in Kellogg's case, she claimed all these visions about Kellogg, and I document right through the book every single one where she was proven to be wrong, and yet she claimed God showed her this. I will say in Tom's favor that certainly there were more visionaries in the 19th century during Ellen's lifetime. And there were a lot of movements. It was a very, active time in terms of religious movements and people claiming to be God and all kinds of bizarre things like that. There's a lot written by this. My major professor at Claremont, Ann Taves, has written an excellent book on trances and visionaries in the 19th century. And I agree with what she writes in there, basically, as it relates to Ellen White. I would also agree with Tom that it's ridiculous to apply Old Testament prophetic tests to Ellen White. It shouldn't be done. The Adventist Church has consistently done that. There's a huge difference between Old Testament prophecy and New Testament and post-New Testament prophecy. I unpack this in both of my books called The Prophetic Rift 1 and 2. And I wrote those before I wrote the psychobiography. But, the problem with Ellen White is that she's the one who made the claims that have caused Adventists to hold her up as an authoritarian Old Testament type prophet. It's not that the White Estate has imposed this on her. The White Estate didn't come into existence until 1915. The evidence I look at in my book is primarily Ellen White's own source documented writings and materials and the historical evidence directly impacting her life and what she said and wrote. And it was Ellen White who made the absolute kinds of claims that, are just outrageous when you really stop and look at them. And I've put these out many times before. I gave them to Peter when I was on the show. They're on Christian Scholars Forum. So I have 25 statements where Ellen makes absolute claims for her prophetic authority that are in many cases blasphemous and in other cases just completely outrageous. Let me just share a few of these, not to belabor the point. 5T67. In these letters I write, talk about her letters, and the testimonies I bear, her testimonies, I am presenting to you that which the Lord has presented to me. I do not write one article in the church paper expressing merely my own ideas. She's saying they're not my ideas. They are what God has opened before me in vision, the precious rays of light shining from the throne of God. I mean, that's an absolute kind of claim. And she's the one who makes it for herself. It's not the White Estate. It's not anyone else. She's making this claim for herself. 1 SM 46. If they, her testimonies, are not heeded, the Holy Spirit is shut away from the soul. I mean, this is a blasphemous statement. If you don't heed what I write, the Holy Spirit cuts you off. You've committed the unpardonable sin. I mean, how outrageous is that for a person who claims to be the prophet of God to say? 5T 661, when I send you a testimony of warning and reproof, many of you declare it's merely the opinion of Sister White. Ah, you have thereby insulted the Spirit of God. Okay, that's another blasphemous statement. You insult the Spirit of God when you say it's my opinion. Come on. I mean,
that's your opinion.
3SM 3252. The testimonies never contradict God's word. There is one straight train of truth without one heretical sentence in that which I have written. I mean, that's so inaccurate. It's so ridiculous. It's so clear from a person who studied the evidence as I have that Ellen was simply a product of her time. She simply took sources, early on in the Adventist movement. She took what Bates and James said, and then she claimed to have visions which gave their views and opinions divine mandates or sanction. And that's why these doctrines were grabbed onto, because Ellen claimed that she saw in vision that they were true, including the shut door, repeatedly, even though the Adventist churches denied that that was the case. That's why I documented in the book. All the references are there. And then Ellen and James tried to delete them and remove them without any admission of doing so after 1851, which was another very dishonest act. I mean, the whole life patterns of Ellen White are one dishonesty after the next. And, you know, you want to argue, okay, look at the fruit. Well, it's just like Peter said, Mormonism has greater fruit than Adventism. The last I heard, they're claiming 60 million people worldwide to Adventism's supposed 20 million. If you're going to just talk about institutions and fame and people helped and this kind of thing, Mormonism has done more than Adventism. Does that make Joseph Smith a true prophet? I mean, come on, it's completely illogical. And when I look at Tom's claims to authority, you know, I've gone on his website and looked at what he claims, and I don't see references. I don't see any research. It's the references Tom Norris says. And it's based on supposedly having this special gnosis from the White estate in Tacoma Park. And I've heard Tom, you know, make this claim. Well, he alone has seen this material, this evidence. He has this special gnosis, this special knowledge. I mean, that's what cults are based on. And it's not true. I have a letter from Gilberto Abella, who was the head of the White Estate on our campus. Jim Nix was the head of the White Estate on Loma Linda campus. I knew him and talked to him about this. Heidi Jameson was the head of the White Estate at Andrews. All four of those places have the exact same documents. This idea that Tom wants to spread, that he alone has seen the truth, and that Adventist historians and researchers, no one really knows the truth except Tom. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just not the case. There's no validity to that. There's so many things that Tom states that any Adventist historian worth his salt would say, you know, that's just absolutely untrue. It's not the case. And this idea that, you know, Tom admits that Ellen White made all these errors and mistakes. The problem is she's claiming God showed her all this stuff in vision again and again and again. I mean, this is fraud. This is called fraud, my friends. When you're claiming God shows you all this stuff and it's completely untrue, it's proven to be untrue, and you couldn't get much more cultic than the shut door stuff. That's why, you know, I emphasize that a lot, because she's claiming that her little group was the only saved group in the world. The whole rest of the wicked world was lost. God had closed their probation. He had sentenced them, you know, to being lost, except for her tiny little group, which was only about 150 by 1851. I mean, it's the most ludicrous. It's even worse than Miller. You know, Miller sets a specific date, and Tom wants to compare the apostles to people like Miller and Ellen White, who set specific dates. Jesus said, no one knows the day or the hour. There's a big difference between believing in an imminent second coming, which is fine, and setting specific dates with specific statements. And you have 3 months left, you know. I mean, Ellen White does this stuff even after the whole Millerite debacle. She didn't learn from it. She does a bunch of date setting after that, all claiming that she received it in vision from God. This is problematic stuff. She's telling people to sell their homes and possessions because time is so short. They have no use for them anymore, but she doesn't do that. She benefits from the money that comes in from that, and people lose their homes and possessions in 1849. And this different versions of this went on all the way up to 1856, 1857. I mean, she didn't learn from this stuff. She got away with making people believe God was showing her almost everything on every subject. You look at her index, it's completely unrealistic that God would just show any person all the stuff that she claimed to receive on every subject imaginable. It's just, there's no precedent for it. There's nothing in history that even comes close to resembling that. She's making these absolute claims for herself that are impossible to justify, and they're easy to refute because the historical evidence overwhelmingly shows that again and again and again she was wrong. Again and again and again she made blatantly false statements. She made blatantly false accusations against people that were proven to be wrong. D.M. Canwright was actually a pretty good guy. You read Dowdy's book on him, and that's a well-documented book. Adventists read this garbage of I was Canwright's secretary, which was 100% fabricated. I can prove it. It was 100% fabricated. Carrie Johnson never even met Canwright. She never knew Canwright, and yet she claimed to be his secretary. It's absolutely revolting. She claimed he had a peg leg when she was his secretary, when he didn't. There's all kinds of evidence that demonstrate, and her grandchildren have been on my thread documenting what Arthur White did with their grandmother and the absolute fraud that was, conducted there. But to compare Ellen to the apostles is ridiculous. To compare what Ellen said about the shut door to Peter not understanding that the gospel was to go to the Gentiles is ridiculous. Did Peter say, oh, God showed me a vision that the Gentiles can never be saved? No, he didn't do that. But he did say, hey, God gave me a revelation in Acts 10 where I now understand that the gospel is to the Gentiles. That's a big difference from Ellen White repeatedly saying, if you deny the shut door, you've committed the unpardonable sin and you're going to hell. I mean, come on, you cannot make this comparison between Ellen White and the apostles. Adventists love to do this, but they're just completely off the wall and wrong in doing so. No one knows the day or the hour, Jesus said, except Ellen White. Again and again and again, she knows the day or the hour. It just always proves to be wrong. That's a huge problem. And I just simply don't buy the buy your fruit argument, because the fruits of her lifetime, when I examined them and researched them, were very tragic. Very tragic. How many people she hurt, how many people she falsely condemned, how many false things she taught, claiming that God showed them to her. That's why I wrote the book. It's heavily documented. I ask every person to read it and decide for themselves. I'm not here to tell you how to think. I'm not here to tell you to agree with me. But that evidence is quite overwhelming. And when I compare it to the evidence that I find on Tom's website, which is Tom Norris Says, I don't think there's much of a comparison personally.
Thanks, Steve. Again, those that are just joining us, my very special guests today are Tom Norris and Steve Daly. And we've made the statement, or I have rather, Ellen G. White was a fraud, yes or no. And we're unpacking both Tom and Steve's divergent views on this topic. Now, what we're going to do now is, Tom, just give you just a brief time, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, just to comment on anything that Steve has said then. And then I've had a lot of people sending questions and private messages, actually, keen to dig into a couple of specific examples where I'll give Steve the floor on this, where Ellen White, in his opinion, is a fraud. And I'm interested in then what Tom would say to those specific examples. We'll pick 2 or 3 there. After that, we will open to the floor to ask some questions. So wait until I ask you guys for that, because I do want to be able to keep an eye on them. We're getting lots of comments going as we progress here. So I'm going to hand that over to you now, Tom. Just there was a few things I'm pretty sure you wanted to say back to Steve there, but just keep it short. This one about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to look at some specifics, Steve. So you may want to have one ear to Tom and one part of your mind thinking about a couple of specific things that you would say confirm Ellen White was a fraud. Over to you, Tom.
Okay. One of the first things I would say about the fruits and Joseph Smith and the Mormons have wonderful fruits, and therefore, you know, the fruits argument isn't made by me. This is Jesus' argument. This is what Jesus teaches in the gospel. So we really don't have the authority, neither you nor me, to say, we don't care about that. We do, and Jesus teaches it, and so we have to deal with it. Secondly, when you look at the fruits of Mormonism and you get into their history, they had a very violent history. I mean, their fruits were towns would go up in fire. They had all kinds of problems. That's why they were running all over the country. Because when they went into a settlement, they started teaching multiple wives, and that got everybody upset that were Protestants and didn't want to hear that. And wherever the Mormons went, there was trouble. There was death, there was fire, there was nothing but pain and hassle. Joseph Smith, I mean, he claims he was a prophet, sure, but he walked around with a sword and a pistol. He preached that he was going to make a country. I mean, he hated democracy, blah, blah, blah. If you look at the Mormons, they did not have good fruits. I don't know what they have today, but back then they had nothing but problems. In fact, if you look at the headlines of the old newspapers in the 70s or something, top of the line, the Mormon problem, the Mormon problem. The Mormons were such problems. The U.S. government had to send soldiers getting ready to attack them in order to calm them down. They were trying to make an independent state in the middle of the country and challenge America. You call that good fruits? Mormons have no good fruits like that. Historically, their fruits are rotten. So first of all, you need to understand your history before you start making these wild comparisons. Oh, Joseph Smith had better fruits than Ellen White. Absolutely not. In fact, his fruits were so bad, he was murdered. He was in jail for murdering someone else, and a mob came and they, murdered him. Those are bad fruits. Murder and all the stuff that followed the Mormons, bad fruit. So don't try to play this game that Ellen White is like the Mormons. It's like Joseph Smith. And I know where you got that from. It's in Canwright's book. It's been in Canwright's book since day one. And your information in your book is 90% Canwright, maybe 95. So that's my comeback to that. In terms of a website, I don't have a website. There's an old forum that's broken and has some information on it. Hopefully Peter will post up the written document that we just wrote about Canwright, and we'll continue to read all about this and about your book. And it already has a couple hundred footnotes in it. And when it's finished, it'll have over 1,000. So I'll footnote and show you everything, including where you're wrong about thousands of things. You don't know what you're talking about when it comes to history or theology or even the teachings of Jesus. Forget Jesus, forget the fruit stuff. And Ellen White's fruit is, some people got mad at her. No, that's not her fruit. So if you don't want to be honest about her fruit and what she did in her life, then that's up to you. But there's plenty of evidence about her fruit. As far as Ellen White being blasphemous, it's not blasphemy if you're a prophet and you've been told to say, look, this is my thing. She's a prophet. She's blasphemy. Who are you to say? Who told you? In fact, in your book, you say you made a deal with God that if God allowed you to write the book and didn't interfere with it, that he was behind you. So for the first 30 years of your life, the Spirit was telling you to help Ellen White, to promote Ellen White, to defend Ellen White. Then all of a sudden, the Spirit is now telling you, attack her, destroy her. And now you think it's your duty to judge and attack and destroy Ellen White. The Spirit has given you no such commission as that. That's blasphemy. Not what Ellen White says, what you're saying. You have no right to say she's a fraud. You have not proven your case whatsoever, not even close. So, and as far as the shut door being a cultic situation, Fine. Then the early church was cultic. Only the Jews could be saved, not the Gentiles, which is the whole world. There was only 3,000 Christians, maybe 5,000. All the rest of the world goes to hell. So when you say it like that about Ellen White, then you have to say it like that about Peter, because he did the same thing. He went around preaching, but not to the Gentiles. They didn't get it, but it was an error. It was a mistake. And he was having visions. Maybe he didn't get the message. Maybe he didn't understand it. Finally, he did. But don't try to pretend that we shouldn't look at the apostles and we shouldn't look at the early church history and learn from it and understand it. You're way too dismissive of Jesus' teachings and the history of the church. All that is there for us. Everything has to be based, judged on the Bible. That's the first thing. You're not doing that. You're trying to base stuff on what Canwright said, or what someone wrote a letter about Ellen White. Oh, she hurt my feelings. What is that? The Bible's not talking about that stuff. When Jesus says you test the New Testament prophet by their fruits, you need to look at their fruits, not pretend they don't have any fruits.
Thanks, Tom. Steve, a couple of minutes just to reply to that, and then we're going to dig deep into a few specific cases where you would say confirm Ellen was in fact a fraud. And by the way, just before you do say that, Tom has written an in-depth. It's 79 pages long, Tom. So I think you'll be able to sell that on Kindle as a little mini book.
That's just part one. That's just part one.
Part one. So I'll be putting a link to that in our comments here. Steve, some thoughts to what Tom just said, and then we're going to shift the conversation to some specifics.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see what he says in that paper. But there's no question that Mormons were much more high profile. There's no question that there was more violence and that kind of thing connected to the movement. And most of the false prophets were ultimately exposed. That's one of the unique things about Ellen White, is that she got away with so much that people like Joseph Smith didn't get away with. But obviously, he was a criminal, and he was much more overt in a lot of the controversial stuff that he did. Ellen and Adventism have been much more covert in terms of a lot of the dishonesty and fraud and things that they've carried out. But I don't think Tom has more training or understanding of history or Jesus or the Bible than I do. I've never had a real estate person tell me in my life that they know more about history and psychology and religion than I do, except Tom. But, the bottom line is that I did not make a deal with God. That's completely mischaracterizing what I wrote in the book. I recognized the book was controversial, and I prayed before writing the book that if this is going to do more harm than good, Lord, don't let it be published. That was just a simple, honest prayer on my part. It wasn't any deal. People try to, some Adventist apologists try to make a big deal of that. That was just a simple, honest prayer. I was not wanting my book to do more harm than good. And I don't think it has. I've heard from thousands of former Adventists and questioning Adventists who have thanked me over and over for writing that book. And it has been tremendously freeing for them, helpful for them. Tom is obviously not aware of this, but I believe the book has done more good than it has harm. Obviously, Adventist apologists aren't going to say that, because they're apologizing for a woman that can't really be defended if you know the evidence. And again, I wasn't reliant on Canwright at all. I was not relying on Canwright at all.
You said that on your website. You admitted it, and I've quoted it in my book. So what you're saying now is not even true. Your whole book is Canwright.
That's a complete joke. There's nowhere in my book where I talked about relying on Canwright, nor did I rely on Canwright.
You say you like Canwright. You think he's a great guy.
I do think Canwright was grossly misjudged and condemned by Ellen in ways that simply won't stand up to what was fair and honest. And Dowdy's book is a great book. I don't know if you've read it. I don't know if you take Carrie Johnson's book, I Was Can Wright's Secretary, seriously, but if you do, I feel sorry for you. And you're going to feel sorry for yourself when the evidence comes out on that.
I suggest you read what Peter's going to post up and look at the sources.
Peter can post it up. Fine. I'm glad to look at what you've put up. But the bottom line is that I've put 326 heavily, extensively documented sources, and you haven't refuted anything, so it's.
Well, no one's asked me to. No one's asked me to. I can easily refute everything you're saying. And I have, and it's been written. You just haven't seen it yet.
Okay, well, that's an easy thing to say. But
well, no, let me stop you right there, Steve. We talked about on your website about the 1856 debate about the law with J.H. Wagner and all that. I posted 1854, whatever. I posted up the real facts of it, which showed that you were wrong. And then you said, I'm locking Tom out of this, out of the website. So don't come on here and pretend I don't have sources and blah, blah, blah. I've given you sources and you've shut me out of your website because you don't want people to know that you don't know what you're talking about.
That's completely inaccurate, what you just said.
Okay, well, read what I post. I'm writing it up and documenting it. So
you didn't
anything
even
I say, forget it, just read it.
The date of Wagner's book. I mean, come on. But the bottom line is that you went off. I've blocked almost no one from my site. I try to be as tolerant as I possibly can. It was overwhelming, by popular demand that I finally blocked you because people just felt you were being so obnoxious, so dogmatic, not supporting what you were saying. It was based on that, and it was just becoming such a negative experience for so many people that they said, hey, we simply can't tolerate this guy anymore.
Nonsense, utter nonsense.
That was the reason. No, it's not. I have the information on my site.
Now, what we're going to do is kind of leave some of these thoughts, unless you did want to add something there, Steve, to what
I would just say,
said.
Tom accuses me of relying on Can Wright, but my book is almost completely based on Ellen White's own source documentation. It's her words. It's not Can Wright. I don't really care what Can Wright said, although I do think he's gotten a bad misjudgment by Adventism. But I go by Ellen White's own source documentation, and again and again and again, she was wrong. She lied. It was proven that she lied. She faked visions. This stuff, to try to justify this and defend her, one or two things. God hates children. I'm going to try to defend that. Amalgamation of man and beast. I'm going to try to defend that. I'm going to try to defend all of her vital force craziness. Okay, but the problem becomes its overwhelming life patterns of dishonesty her entire lifetime. That's why I wrote the book, because it's overwhelming and it's her entire lifetime. It's not like she turned into some saint after 1888. She didn't. This idea that Adventist reform has is completely not accurate. It's not historically sound.
Now, thanks, Steve. I was watching a really interesting interview with you, Tom, with the Brenners. It was on the Scholars Forum, and you were talking about a time when Ellen had a vision about Kellogg, and it turned out that the vision wasn't accurate, even though she had taken him to task over it. When he proved that it wasn't accurate, what you were saying was that she had just misinterpreted the vision. The vision probably was accurate, but her interpretation of that was inaccurate. Can you just unpack, if you remember, what that exact story was? I just don't remember the details, and just share again why you felt that even though she inaccurately or falsely accused Kellogg, how you were able to feel comfortable with her perhaps just misinterpreting the vision when she actually was playing out a role of being quite nasty and hurtful to Kellogg.
In Steve's book, he makes a statement that Ellen White never said she was sorry, never said she was wrong. And when I saw that on his website or in the book, I sent him a statement from Ellen White out of Testimonies where she apologized and said, I got it wrong. Someone told me some information. I misunderstood it. I apologize. I was wrong. And that's in my book documented back. I don't have it in front of me. So I think that's what you're referring to is she got things wrong.
Do you remember what the facts were of that particular? I just remember thinking it was an interesting story as well, just as a bit of an aside. Do you remember what it was that she was claiming Kellogg had done?
Something about the sand. It was something about the sand that she got wrong, and then she apologized. Said, I got it wrong. I didn't understand it. Blah blah blah. Another time about the Sabbath. She was keeping the Sabbath from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock, as Joseph Bates was teaching everyone. And she had visions about the Sabbath. But yet, at some point, Jay and Andrew said, look, this is wrong. It shouldn't be 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. It should be evening to evening. And so they had Battle Creek. They had a theological, all the guys came together and they did a study. And sure enough, Andrews was correct. And so now they were going to have to change from what they've been doing for 9 years. And then the question came up, well, Ellen White, you've been doing this 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. You've had a number of visions about the Sabbath. Why didn't you catch this? Why didn't you know this? And then James White jumps in and says, look, I'm glad it happened this way because we don't get our doctrines from Ellen White. We get it from Bible study. So that's the first thing he said about it. And then the second thing, as he looked at the visions, he said she never had a specific vision about 6 o'clock or 6 o'clock. She never had it on that particular point. So this idea that Ellen White never made mistakes or that she never corrected herself or everyone in Battle Creek knew that Ellen White was wrong about the Sabbath for 9 years. And it didn't bother them because they said, look, we don't get our doctrines from Ellen White. That's not how it worked. So, and that's all documented. This is all going to be easily documented stuff. But Steve says, she never says she was wrong. No, it never happened. Well, it did happen. Happened in front of Battle Creek.
Just another quick aside. Do you think that she got it wrong with October 22, something actually happening in 1844? Do you think that was
Peter? They all got it
incorrect?
Wrong. They all got it wrong. They were all wrong.
But being the most distinctive Adventist doctrine, which kind of gradually spawned the sanctuary and the investigative judgment, do you think the assessment of the 2,300 days, something actually happening in heaven in a supernatural way on October 22, 1844, do you think she got that wrong?
Absolutely. She got it wrong. I mean, I can tell you stuff that she got wrong. Besides that, I'll give you a big one that will kind of, people go like, what? Ellen White talks about the Sabbath being in Eden and Adam and Eve did the Sabbath. And, a million places you'll see Ellen White talking about the Sabbath and early on. Well, there's no such thing. There's no Sabbath in the book of Genesis. Nobody kept the Sabbath. No one knew about the Sabbath in the book of Genesis, not one other person. So does that make her a false prophet? No, she didn't understand that. And most people don't understand it today. The Sabbath only shows up in Exodus. You ask any Jew. There's no Sabbath no one kept the Sabbath in Genesis. And there's other things that I could say. She thinks the earth was 6,000 years old because that's what they taught back then. And that's what everyone believed. Well, it's not 6,000 years old. It's like 4 billion years old. And if you understand the Hebrew, you can defend that in Genesis. The Jews understand that the earth is much older than 6,000, but the Adventists somehow seem to have missed it, and so did Ellen White. I'm not here to defend. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Peter's going around doing all kinds of stuff ahead of the church, but he's doing it wrong. He's letting millions of people won't even let him in the church. So you can be a prophet, have legitimate spiritual gifts, and wreck your car and burn, set the stove on fire and get theology wrong. This idea that if you get things wrong, you don't have spiritual gifts is absurd. And we need to look at the New Testament to understand that. Not any place else, not Canwright, the New Testament. And we need to treat Ellen White the way Jesus says she should be treated if she was a tare. This idea, oh, we don't care what Jesus teaches, go ahead, attack. And as far as me attacking Steve as a tare, I'm only defending. I'm not attacking. I'm not. Anyone wants to go to Steve's church, go ahead. Yeah, I'm not going to attack you. I'm not going to say he's illegitimate and you shouldn't go to his church. Go ahead. I'm following Jesus as best I can.
Besides fruits like schools and churches and publishing houses, is there a specific vision or teaching or inspirational comment that she has made that you can highlight specifically that you do think she got right?
Well, I mean, she got a lot of things right. I mean, she developed a denomination, helped millions of people. Was she a legalist, if that's what your question is? Absolutely. They were all legalists. Most Christians were legalists of any denomination. That's why you have Sunday laws. They're trying to force you to obey the fourth commandment. And that's another thing, by the way, that Adventists are going to need to recalculate. There is no fourth commandment, obedience, Sabbath stuff. That's Old Testament. Jesus never taught the fourth commandment. He never went around and told people, don't you work on the Sabbath. That's the Old Testament. That's the Sabbath of Moses. Ellen White did not understand that. And neither does anyone else today here, but she was wrong about it. So what? That doesn't mean she doesn't have the Spirit back then to help her develop the church. I mean, the Spirit's just not given to perfect people. There's no perfect people.
Now, thanks, Tom. Now we're going to cross back to Steve, just to give us one or two specific instances that you think would firmly place Ellen White in the fraudulent basket. So perhaps share just two or three, and then we'll dig into one of them. And we'll get Tom's feedback.
There's a ton of them. My book's filled with them. But she took her first vision from Joseph Turner to start with. But then she taught the shut door and made absolute statements about that for 7 years, telling people they were guilty of the unpardonable sin if they rejected it. You look at the kinds of statements she makes there about the shut door, and you think about the content of that teaching, that just their tiny little group was saved and the whole rest of the world was lost. It's such a completely asinine doctrine, and claiming that I was shown, that's the big problem with Ellen White. It's always, I was shown. God showed me this. That's the problem. Peter never said, I was shown that no Gentiles will be saved. You just simply can't compare the apostles to Ellen White. She's constantly saying, I was shown. God showed me this. Look at these claims she makes for herself. You can't say that, oh yeah, she had the right to do that, when she's wrong constantly, when it's clear that she was just taking stuff from the sources of her day. I mean, this is such a clear, cut and dried case to objective people. But when you're an apologist and when you've grown up with this Ellen White stuff and you've never known any better or researched it at the level that I have, then,
What level is that, Steve? What deep level do you have about Ellen White? What do you know that's so secret about Ellen White that no one else knows?
A whole lifetime
scholars, all of what people at the White Estate. What do you know?
I've written 2 doctoral dissertations, a master's thesis in history. I've taught SDA history for more than 24 years as a university professor or teacher. I taught SDA history many of those years. I can ask you the same. What do you have? You went into the White Estate in Tacoma Park and talked with somebody? I know Bert Holoviak. I doubt very much that Bert Holoviak would be wanting to identify with you. He's on a very different wavelength than you are, from what I know about Bert Holoviak. But
this will only be settled with writing and sources. This oral thing. That's why I wanted to write something before I came on, because the he said, she said is just absurd.
And I think
Right.
too, I think also, Tom, what I remember about our interview that I think it was part of season 2, the Glacier View, and you were reflecting on that, and part of the defrocking of Ford was because Pearson and Wilson Senior were worried that Ellen's authority was being challenged, and that would destroy the church. And I think you've run with the ball that says, no, we can challenge her authority. Let's not put it against the Bible, and possibly almost anything that Steve would say was confirmation of her being fraudulent is no, that was just her being inaccurate or human. Would that be a correct assessment there?
Well, Ellen White has no biblical authority, and I never said she did. So
She said she
did. If she's wrong or she's right, fine. But the Bible has to determine any doctrine, including the Sabbath. And if you look at the Sabbath, she doesn't have that quite right yet. The Adventists have not. They think they have the 7-day Sabbath right. They haven't completed Sabbath.
I remember when I did the interview with you, I remember thinking, hang on, is Tom a Seventh-day Adventist? Because it was almost like there's you and a number of other scholars and apologists and commentators that I've interviewed. There's another kind of Adventism that's almost never really fully seen the light of day that I think you guys represent. Okay, so just back to Steve. I want to hear something more than just the shut door. Give us another one that puts her in a fraudulent sort of space.
Okay. Of course, there's the fake vision that she did to win Bates over, where she was completely inaccurate. What she was claiming God was showing her about the planets and the beings on Jupiter and all this kind of stuff. It's very, when you look at the historical background of that, it's so clear that her and James needed Bates desperately, and they were living in complete poverty. Without Bates, I don't think the movement would have ever made it. And so they had to do this con job on him, which anyone who looks at that objectively, I think it's really difficult to say God was showing her this. On page 244 of my book, Proven False Ellen White Accusations Against Kellogg, I list 6 of them here. And in every single case, she makes this gross accusation against Kellogg that she saw in vision. And in every single case, it's absolutely proven to be false. I mean, this kind of stuff just goes on her whole life. And,
Kellogg was her enemy. You can't trust anything Kellogg said or did. He was her enemy. He stole the sand from the church.
It was proven by outside sources, not by Kellogg. It was proven by outside sources.
You don't understand Kellogg and Ellen White. You don't know what happened in Battle Creek. You've missed it. They're enemies.
I think I understand it.
You can't go to Ellen White's enemies to get information about how bad of a person she is. That's not how it works.
That's why these are objective sources. The fraud that James committed, the embezzlement he committed, There's
no proof of that. You're just saying stuff.
It was acknowledged by the church. The church paid the money back to the sand. They don't do that.
You're just saying stuff. I'm writing in detail with sources to refute your oral stuff and your written stuff. Cody Baron-Housen, how about that? You say there was lawsuits.
Between us.
Where are the lawsuits?
Here's the difference between us. You've had my sources since 2020 to try to refute. You haven't done it. You haven't. I haven't even seen your sources. You haven't even.
I'm trying to get them to you. I'm trying to get them to you.
Okay, I'll be glad to look at them because I'm sure they're going to be quite humorous.
Let's look into just Tom's thoughts on the one about Joseph Bates, where she definitely was telling him what he wanted to hear. What are your thoughts on what went wrong there, Tom?
Well, first of all, it must have worked. We sit here in the 21st century and say, oh, she gave him a con job. Whatever she told him, it worked and things went forward. So maybe that's what the Spirit wanted to happen. If she'd have said, oh, let me give you some information from the Hubble telescope in the 100 years in the future, he'd have looked at her and said, "You're nuts. And there's no way to talk about that or say that what she's saying is true." So in her day, in her culture, what she told him was correct. It did the job, and they went forward. Case closed. You don't come back 100 years later and go, "Oh, wow, she gave a phone." We know that there's more stuff in outer space now than there was back then, and she got it wrong.
So the
Not
means
necessarily.
justify the end kind of thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Why not? The Spirit's got to get things done. Ellen
So
White's
God
got to
gives
make
her a
fruit.
false vision to win Bates over.
Well, first of all, Bates was a tough guy. You know, he was a former captain. He was a tough, rough guy. And you say in your book, Ellen White took him by the nose and led him around and tricked him and conned him. You're not going to con a guy like that. He deals with rough sailors. He was captured. He was thrown in prison for a couple of years. He's the most active, dangerous, whatever kind of guy you want to say of all the pioneers. He did more wild things than all of them put together. And to say that little 100-pound, 20-year-old Ellen White took him by the nose and manipulated him, that's what you say in your book, is incredibly absurd.
I mean, that's
just
completely
nonsense.
Untrue. I don't say
And
that.
listen to this. Bates is the one that turned on James and Ellen White to the Sabbath. He's the one that wrote about the seventh day. He's the one that converted them to the Sabbath. So how is she taking him by the nose?
I never said she led him by the nose anywhere, except deceiving him in that vision. But if you read my book and comprehend it, I say that James and Bates were the ones setting the doctrinal agenda, and then Ellen came along and confirmed everything by vision, even though it was completely false in many cases. And it was latched onto because Ellen had the vision. I mean, the vision.
Did Ellen White get anything right? Did she do anything right in her life? I mean, how do you build an empire and she's wrong all the time? That's hard to do. What did she do anything right?
There's a lot of empires that have been built on deceit, deception. I mean, come on. Do you not know history?
Okay, what did she do right? Did she do anything right? All this happened just magically.
I mean, she lied and got people to believe.
That's not right. What did she do right? Can you tell me one thing she did right?
Oh, I'm sure she was nice to people she liked. And, you know, there was all kinds of nice things she would have done. But that doesn't make her a good person when she's doing all this deceit and, you know, dishonesty. Come on.
You know, there's in my paper, I quote Kellogg, and I quote Canright too, telling what they feel about Ellen White, you know, what they think she kind of person she is. They do not come close to what you're saying. In fact, they say the opposite.
They were personal friends.
You know, when Peter posts it up, you can read this information and see that it doesn't make any sense to what you're saying. Canright, even after he hated Ellen White, but he still said she was honored and sincere.
Now, a Facebook commenter has said, "I want to see the resources," and I'm just putting that up there because I am posting them. Tom has done a 79-page part 1 of his thoughts on this. So I don't know who actually wrote that, but it will be coming up on the group later. And I think you're going to be publishing it too, aren't you, Tom?
At some point, there's a lot more to go. I'm going to do the 1888. I'm going to stop all this nonsense. People say, "Oh, you know what?" I just write it out.
And you've got some interesting views on the Sabbath too. There's a lot of things I think you disagree with Adventism, but overall, the big picture for you is that it's doing some good stuff.
Well, Peter, there's no denomination that's ever existed that's gotten everything right, not even the early church. So this idea that Adventism has to be perfect or better, whatever truth is there, that's what you want. And what truth Adventism has is about eschatology. That's their contribution to the world. And they kind of botched it up, and you know, that's what needs to get fixed. So I'm not here to defend Ellen White per se. I'm here to try to get Adventism out of the ditch and get it going forward, because the world is not looking too good right now.
Now, Steve, I want you to share another thing. You mentioned about the James fraud thing. Unpack that story for us a little bit more.
Yeah, James was, first of all, he was accused of embezzlement and misusing church funds way back when the Messenger Party left in 1853. So this wasn't a unique accusation that just came.
What were the details? What were the details of the accusation?
When the Messenger Party left, they said they left because they were for two primary reasons. Number one, Ellen's visions were false. That they didn't stand up to the truth or scrutiny, and that James was embezzling church funds and misusing them for the Whites' own personal use. So those were the two things they had all kinds of documentation that they based this on. But Kellogg was the one who actually proved it when James was getting up in years, shortly before he died, and he died young, of course, and when Kellogg was asking him for the money, James was resistant. And then James got deathly sick, and James paid Kellogg the money. This was $5,000, which was the equivalent of at least $150,000 to $250,000, depending on how you figure it today. And so Kellogg, was at least thankful that James had given him the money that belonged to the Sand that he'd embezzled from them. And then James recovered, and he demanded the money back. And Ellen had a vision saying, yes, the money belongs to James. And so Kellogg was just furious about this, but the church supported James and Ellen because she had this vision. So the money went back to went back to James, and he used it to pay back another $5,000 that he had embezzled from the Review and Herald. So, he had two documented cases of embezzling, let's say, approximately $200,000 from two different church institutions. And then when James died, Kellogg brought forward all the evidence, all the documentation. He showed it to the church leaders. He threatened to take it to the General Conference and to the legal authorities. And when he did that, the church said, you're right. We are giving you this money back. So, even despite Ellen's vision, despite the whole thing, Kellogg was proven to be right, and James was proven to be an embezzler.
That story has been debunked. That's just nonsense.
It's not debunked.
We'll write about it. We'll look at it and see it, check it out.
Now, I want to just open to the floor because it sometimes takes 5 minutes for messages to get through. If you've got a question specific for Tom or for Steve, I've got a feeling that what I'm really enjoying is that both of you are getting to share on a platform your divergent views. One of the things I like about SDAQ&A is we have a community that truly represents Adventism. There are Reformer Adventists, there are Conservative Adventists, there's every one on the spectrum in between. It's a rare opportunity to actually give people a platform sharing these diverse views. And I've got a feeling, though, that both of you will never actually come to a point where you agree, and I'm not sure you'll come to a point where you agree to disagree. But what is coming about, though, is some really interesting conversation and dialogue, and I appreciate that you're both stimulating that. I'm going to just come to a couple of quick questions while the main bulk will be coming through, and this one is for Tom. You kind of answered this a little bit before, but what aspects of Adventism does Tom actually believe in, apart from Ellen White's good influence?
The paradigm of the three angels' messages is what Adventism is all about: eschatology, second coming. First of all, the gospel, second coming, the Sabbath, the gospel Sabbath, which they haven't figured out yet, not the old covenant Sabbath. There's about 7 fundamental pillars from the three angels' messages. The investigative judgment is not one of them. So Adventism is about eschatology, and the only reason the Sabbath has any relevance or importance is because they connected it to eschatology. So that's the point of Adventism, and I would ask Steve if he agrees with Canright Canwright did not believe in the three angels' messages. He said there is no last day message. He didn't believe in the Sabbath. And he believed in the second coming, but it was not close and it was no big deal. So the question would be to Steve, do you believe anything in Adventism, or should the Adventist church just not exist?
Steve?
Does Adventism
Clearly, I'm not
does
an
it have
Adventist.
anything to give?
I haven't been an Adventist for 12 years. And,
Well,
you know, certainly most of the things, if I had to say one thing in Adventism that I feel positive about, generally, it would be that the wicked are not tortured for eternity. I don't
Okay.
believe that God tortures the wicked for eternity. I
Good.
believe hell is a result and consequence of sin itself, and that God doesn't have to add anything to sin to make it worse than what it already is. So, you know, even though Adventists didn't get this from God, they got it from other sources of their day. I do happen to, I really find that to be the most despicable doctrine in Christianity, that God tortures the lost for eternity. I find that to be completely despicable and completely misrepresentative of the character of God. So I am
You and Ellen White agree on that.
at least I'm well, it's not because Ellen White said it.
I know.
It's
It
because
doesn't matter. You still agree with her whether she said it or not. So there are some things where you can appreciate from Ellen White, and you just articulated one, which I agree
Yeah.
with. That's
course,
a
I
horrible
didn't-
doctrine, and all the other churches teach it. So Adventism has it right.
most of them.
Now, here's a comment. I'll just put some comments up as well. Leave Adventism in the ditch. There are more important things to save. This is one for Steve. Please have Steve talk about the shouting Methodists.
Yeah, they were quite a crazy bunch. And they weren't a separate church from Methodism, but they were a movement within Methodism that primarily focused in the camp meeting settings. And even though you did see some shouting Methodist traditions and actions in the churches, certainly, it was in the camp meeting settings that the shouting Methodists were guilty of the worst kind of charismania. I mean, we're talking about charismania that was completely ridiculous. Not just shouting, but animal, crawling. I mean, you name it, every charismatic excess you can possibly think of can be found with these shouting Methodists. And they were legalists on top of it. They believed that, no one could be saved except by a ring. And they had these different rings that they formed, and all the rings competed with each other, shouting as loud as they could, shouting down the devil, shouting down the speakers. They didn't believe that preaching saved anybody. It was only the rings. And so it was this gross legalism based on their shouting and their ring theology and all these charismatic extremes and excesses. And that's where Ellen White found her identity in Methodism. It wasn't in her local Methodist church. She was baptized in the camp meeting setting, and she gained prominence as a visionary in the shouting Methodist craziness. And I believe that's where she got started off on a very unfortunate track. She went on from there to get involved with other extremists and then into the Millerism extremism. So she was just in one fanatical thing after the next. And then she, claims to be this great visionary that gives hope to these disillusioned Millerites who were on the verge of complete hopelessness. So they latched onto this little 17-year-old's vision, which was taken from Joseph Turner. It wasn't even a vision. I honestly don't believe Ellen had any visions from God in her lifetime. She certainly had some visionary experiences, and, to what degree those were largely emotional, to what degree they had something to do with her head injury, to what degree they were from the dark side. There's a whole bunch of different theories and possibilities about where she got her emotionalism and visionary stuff. But I do not believe any of them came from God. I no longer believe that. When I was in the Adventist church, before I studied through this stuff thoroughly, I did believe Ellen was a visionary and that she got visions from God. but I haven't believed that for quite a few years, about 12, 14 years now.
And Tom, would you believe that Ellen did have supernatural visions from God?
Oh, absolutely. The people in her day all determined that. I mean, one or two didn't like it, but all the people that she interacted with, that's what they said. You know, who am I to come back and say, hey, you're lying? She didn't really do it, and you shouldn't have believed her, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. She proved herself in her world to enough people to develop a global religious empire. You can't do that unless you're doing something right. It's so difficult now, or even then, to develop a chain of hospitals and schools and churches. I think people are so underestimating the smartness of this woman. How in the world you can do what she did, write what she wrote, accomplish what she did, and then all of a sudden it's from the devil. She's a fraud. She's a phony. She's a gold digger. It is absurd.
How do you feel? How do you feel though when there are many examples of prophets and inspirational leaders that have built up these empires, but they are fraudulent? I mean, we could sit back and go, well, these, you know, you can't really pin anything on them, but there's definite.
You know what the pioneers said about that? They acknowledged that there's plenty of frauds and religious frauds and phony prophets, but they said that's proof that there can be real ones. That's not proof that no one can be a prophet or have visions or spiritual gifts.
How do you choose between the false ones and the real ones?
You have to choose by their fruits. You have to choose by the word. You have to choose. That's how you choose. I mean, but the point, to answer your question, in Ellen White's day, the people around her, whether it was Joseph Bates or James White or a million people that joined the Adventist Church and interacted with her, they thought she was the genuine thing. Kellogg did. Kenwright did for a while. At the end, he said no. He said, I do not believe you've had real visions. You make stuff up. In fact, he told her, he said, you just make it up as you go along. So that's what he said. But thousands of other people didn't say that. They legitimately said she had spiritual gifts. When she died, what happened? And no one come to her funeral because she was such a bad person, such a criminal, such a religious fraud. She had 3 funerals. Over 5,000 people came. The whole town turned out. Everybody said nothing but good about her. If she was a false prophet, a fraud, a gold digger, all the things that Kenwright and Daly say, nobody would have showed up. People would have thrown eggs at her.
Couldn't that be said about? Couldn't that be said about Benny? Couldn't that be said, for example, about Benny Hinn when he passes? I'm sure he'll have many people come to his funeral.
I think when Benny Hinn, if he's the one I'm thinking about that got in all kinds of trouble, I mean, he's in trouble now. If he's the guy I'm thinking about, these guys get in big trouble. Ellen White never did that. She never had any affairs. She never did it. She didn't get a jet airplane. She didn't do any of the things what you would think a crazy, fanatical person would do. She didn't do it. Look at her life. Her life is under a glass. Every word she writes, her diaries, her books, she's writing every day. You can know her thoughts. You can know what she eats. You can know who she writes to. They write to her back. I've read hundreds and hundreds of her letters. She's sharp. She's smart. She's always discussing theology. She's nowhere. She's nothing what Kenwright and Daly are painting her. Nothing like it.
Steve,
Yes.
there's one here for you. Where's it gone? Boy, there's so many. And also test the prophet. If you're still around, I'd love you to ask a couple of questions. I know that you had a few. If you're still watching, please jump in and ask a few questions. The one I was looking at, Steve's gone. While I'm finding it, something popped into my mind. Do you think sometimes people are upset with your approach because sometimes, for example, the one where Ellen White had a leaning, or some would say an addiction to vinegar or a certain type of vinegar, whereas you kind of said she was an alcoholic. Is that the kind of thing that would upset people like Tom, do you think? And tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, that's out of her own diary, of course, and that was stuff that the White estate hid, and it was only because of the hacking. That's one reason I got reinterested in Adventism, was the hacking of the White estate and seeing documents released that had been withheld in the secret Z file from researchers, and that was quite annoying to me that they were dishonest with me as a researcher when I was working there, doing my research there. But, she's the one that admits to almost dying from this addiction. And she says it's just vinegar. But when you look at her, go through her diaries, she's making all kinds of homemade wines, vinegar wine and grape wine and apple wine. And she's making wines of every type and giving them to neighbors. And the alcohol content of these things was uncontrolled, and you don't get addicted to vinegar in a manner that kills you. She's talking about major alcohol withdrawal symptoms here in the diary, and the vinegar wine could have had a very high alcohol content, and we know she kept a great deal of alcohol in her home based on her diary. So it's just a logical conclusion that this was vinegar wine that she was addicted to, not vinegar. And she also condemned vinegar too. So if it had just been vinegar alone, she still would have been violating her own testimonies. But this was clearly something that included alcohol, not just vinegar by itself.
What were your thoughts on that one, Tom?
So it's just ridiculous. So Ellen White's a bootlegger now. She's selling, giving out booze. This is crazy
it's
stuff.
In her own diary. I'm not the one that wrote it.
Yeah, well, she writes all kinds of stuff in her diary. So what? Back then they say all kinds of stuff that today people would look at and misinterpret. Ellen White no more is an alcoholic than the man. This is absurd. Absurd.
But if she is writing in her diaries that she had an addiction and problems with it, but specifically was telling people to steer away from vinegar, doesn't that seem a little bit incongruous?
Well, again, unless you look exactly what's happening in the details of it, you really can't pass judgment on oral discussion like this. You have to look at the details. And if she did something wrong, she did something wrong. So what? So what? The Bible's full of people with spiritual gifts who did things wrong. They killed people. They committed adultery. Doesn't mean you're not legitimately having spiritual gifts. King David. So this is the point. If she did something wrong, okay, she's human like the rest of us. That doesn't delegitimize whatever good she did or whatever correct counsel she has to give. You take what's good, get rid of the stuff that's bad. How hard is that to be? The problem is everyone's saying it's all or nothing. All or nothing. It's not all or nothing. If it's all or nothing, then Peter is a fraud, and don't read his book because he made horrible mistakes, and so did Paul, blah, blah, blah. So you can throw the whole Bible out because of the mistakes.
Ellen White's the one who says my work's either all of God or it's all of the devil. She's the one that says that.
That's a mistake. That's a mistake for her to say that. That's a stupid thing to say, and it's not true. So what? Let's move on.
It's just
one of many. Take every word she says as gospel and then attack it and say she's wrong. I don't take every word she says as gospel, and you shouldn't either. She says
it all comes from the throne of God. I mean, come on.
That's what she thinks. She's the one with spiritual gifts, not me, not you. And if that's how she views it, let her view it that way.
Someone has written, Jim Jones started well.
That's right. He did start well.
Ellen White is finished. Ellen White started and she finished. You have her whole life to look at, and she certainly didn't end up like Jim Jones. So to even make that kind of comparison is complete slander and defamation. She's nothing like any of those quack crazy guys that you keep trying to compare it to.
Here's someone for Tom. Why isn't Tom a Scientologist? I can probably answer that one, but maybe Buddhist. Why not maybe choose another kind of spiritual leader? Why is it because you were born into Adventism that you've sort of stuck with it, Tom?
The point here about Ellen White is Adventism. Adventism is what is important. The end of the world is what is important. The second coming, eschatology, that is what is important. To the extent that Ellen White can help us understand that, that's the use of Ellen White. We don't need her for anything else. I mean, health is fine. She taught us some good things about that, whatever. That's wonderful. But eschatology, the Adventist church was supposed to focus on eschatology. That's why it's here. Other religions focused on different things. Methodists focused on sanctification and stuff, and they had some errors, of course, but that was what their thing was. They weren't in eschatology. Nobody really was. Adventists were born to introduce modern eschatology, and Adventism did that. Now, you can say they don't know what they're doing, except they survived. They worked out a paradigm. They ended up making a global empire. And now we're looking at it and it's all messed up. I understand that. It's all screwed up. But there is some truth in there that we need to recover and go forward. And Ellen White understands that truth better than anyone else. You're not going to go to another denomination and find out any information about the time of trouble, end of the world, eschatology. They don't care about it. They're just not into it. Adventism is into it. So we need to take what we've got, which is broken, and fix it. I'm not at all saying what's there is perfect. It's all messed up. Look at Glacier View. What a catastrophe. Get rid of the gospel and Dr. Ford. That's the worst. That is just horrible. But that's all got to be undone. That doesn't mean Adventism is totally worthless. The Jews did all kinds of awful things, but without Judaism, you wouldn't have the gospel or the church. So yeah, they really messed up and they had some really bad guys and blah, but there's still truth there. And so we need to get the truth, whatever it is, wring it out of Adventism, wring it out of Ellen White, discard what's wrong, like the investigative judgment. That's wrong. Well, they didn't know it then. They were, they innocently got into weird stuff. Okay, understand. Let's fix it. Let's fix it. And you can't fix it by destroying Ellen White. She's got the secret to it. She's the, before 1850, the Three Angels' Messages was developed. It happened when she was very young. All this other stuff, years and years later, they've made no real improvements to it since then. All they've been doing is fighting about it. And what does it mean? The foundations of Adventism were put together by 1850, and she was part of that. Did they get messed up? Yeah, they messed a lot of stuff up, but there's some good stuff there in the Three Angels' Messages, and we need to get that. And demonizing Ellen White is not going to help anybody understand whatever truth is in Adventism.
Now,
that's all I'm saying.
Here's a question for Tom. It's kind of a two-parter, and this is Test the Prophet. Highly recommend. Go and find Test the Prophet on YouTube. Fantastic YouTube channel from our mystery man, or woman, our mystery person, Test the Prophet. He's asked Tom, what is Tom's opinion on those, and it's two-parter, Tom, so I'll read both. What is Tom's opinion on those during her time who practiced mesmerism that included many supernatural manifestations, such as extraordinary strength? Followed with, how do you differentiate between their visions and her visions, especially when many of these mesmerists also had visions of people on other planets?
Her visions were always focused on the Three Angels' Messages. She was always working on the church. She was always helping the church. When it gets to sanctification, she's in their business and she's correcting this and like a mother hen. That's what her life's work was. Adventism. She gave her whole life to it. She spent every day developing it. It ended up being a tremendous global empire. And here we come in the 21st century, all kinds of problems. The world could be gone. It could be the end in 10 years or something with climate. If she was here, she would be screaming at Adventists like, "What are you doing? Get your message together. Jesus is going to come. Focus on the second coming." Adventists have focused so much on the investigative judgment, they're clueless about the second coming. They don't even know what's going to happen, why, when, where. They spent 50 years chasing the investigative judgment phantom doctrine, and now they are so ignorant of real theology. It's a shame. This is a tragedy.
And I guess the second part of his question, how do you differentiate between their visions and her visions?
Because her visions are focused on Scripture. These other people's visions, they're focused on whatever, this, that, or the other thing. Ellen White stuck to the three angels' messages her whole life. In fact, it was Kellogg who came to her and said, "Look, let's forget the three angels' messages. We just want to do health. We can do so much good with health, blah, blah, blah." And she said, "Absolutely not." And that was their big fight. He wanted to go big on health. She wanted to keep the eschatology and the three angels' messages. And that was what that's why they separated. So that's the problem there. No matter what you did with Ellen White, she was not going to budge from the three angels' messages, which includes the fourth angel's message, which is the finishing touch to the three angels' messages. That was her thing. That was her theme. That was her. So if you're into the second coming, then you should be into Ellen White.
This is for Tom, but I also want Steve to comment on it. How does this Ellen White defender, they're referring to you, Tom, know that what he is reading is actually the words of Ellen G. White? She sounded intelligent because of her literary borrowing. Very little of her writings were her own. So, Tom, you first, and then I'm interested in Steve's thoughts on the literary borrowing.
Well, first of all, this is a myth that most of her writings are borrowed and all that. That's just a complete myth. The Coney Barrenhausen story, which Steve in his book says in at least 3 places is true, lawsuit, pull the book off the shelves, all that kind of stuff. I have documented, and it's not coming up now, but it come in the other parts. It's a complete myth, complete nonsense. It never happened at any time.
A.G. Daniels refers to it in the 1919 minutes.
I know he does, and his 30-year memory is nothing more than a memory.
All right.
I will prove and can prove, and it's already been written. Steve, you just haven't seen it. So before you laugh, wait till you read it, and then everybody can read it. So this thing about plagiarism is just it was started by Kellogg. That's where it came from.
What about the 8-year study with Fred Veltman?
Absolutely.
Fred Veltman's fine. I mean, he didn't come. People have misquoted Fred Veltman.
But you've read the is it 2,000 page summary of that?
Yes, I've read it, and he's being misquoted. He says that.
It's his words though. I'm talking about his report that he released after the 8-year
people
study.
are quoting his report and saying he came out and said she did all this copying. He didn't say that, and that's not what happened. But again, we will prove all this stuff, but I'm just telling you, the Coney Barrenhausen story is a complete and utter fraud. And in fact, if you go to, I forget what page on there's a chart in there, Peter, that follows what everybody says about the Coney Barrenhausen, who started it, who added to it. You know what happened? I'll tell you quickly. When Canwright wrote his first book, Seventh-day Adventism Renounced, in 1888, in that book, he says she plagiarized, blah, blah, blah. Not Coney Barrenhausen. He's talking about The Great Controversy, Volume 4, 1884. Volume 4. He never once in any of his 14 editions of Seventh-day Adventism Renounced says a word about the Coney Barrenhausen Life of Paul story. It's never there. That's not where it comes from. It comes in 1907 from Kellogg and Stewart. And then when Canwright writes his 1919 book against Ellen White, he puts a whole chapter in there of the Coney Barrenhausen thing.
But what about when you actually read her work and the Coney Bear work? Even the headings are exactly the same.
Well, there's very little very little copying going from Coney Barrenhausen to Life of Paul. Very little, but that's not the story. The story is she was sued. The story is she pulled the book off the shelf because she was a bad girl. None of that happened. It's a complete made-up story.
But if none of that happened, when you do read the two, I've read both of the books together, and it's hard to know which one you're reading.
Well, that's why people said what they said.
How would you explain that?
Coney Barrenhausen, Peter, is not a theological work. It's about landscape, topography, descriptions of the first century. It has nothing to do with doctrine. It's a non-sectarian book, to quote the Adventists. So she used a lot of it, and here's what really happened.
Wouldn't that be unethical?
Pardon?
Wouldn't that be unethical, though?
Well, back in that day, when you read the report, you'll see it's not unethical. Back then, that's what they did. People can say, "Oh, that's not true." Well, it is true. Just read what I wrote. And here's what happened, though. W.C. White, who is only 21 years old, his father had died in 1881, and now he had to take over his mother, being the manager for his mother. He overlooked putting in a preface in that book, which would have talked about we didn't use quotations, blah, blah, blah. He forgot to do it. He was only 21 years old. So what happens when you have the Harrisburg debates, which I will detail? We found about 13 Harrisburg articles. Steve, you quote one. You missed about 13 of them. And what Canwright is doing there, he's saying it's 50%. He's saying all this stuff. And when the Adventists found out what Canwright was doing, they put the preface in the edition of the 1888 Great Controversy, which deals with quotations and what was left out and why Ellen White doesn't do quotations. Had he put that in the front of the Paul's book, that would have been, Canwright wouldn't have had much to say about it. He failed to put that in there. But in the 1888 edition of the Great Controversy, read the author's preface, 4 or 5 pages, where she is responding back to Canwright and saying, here's how this works. Here's how spiritual gifts work. Here's how my quotations work, blah, blah, blah. So that's the problem with that book. W.C. White forgot to put in the preface that says, look, we don't use quotations, blah, blah, blah. We're doing it this way. Or we should have put some in and done it. They just didn't do it right. But that's got nothing to do with the story. There was no people saying, oh, you copied too much. There was no lawsuit. There was no demand letter. There was no pulling the book off. It's a complete made-up story, and Canwright knew it. The reason he didn't put it in his Seventh-day Adventist Renounced is because he would be sued for slander. That's why. After Ellen White died in 1915, he puts it in his 1919 book. A whole chapter making it look like this Coney Barrenhausen thing is just an unbelievable, horrible thing that she did. It's a complete fraud and phony.
And Tom,
it never happened.
Tom, your thoughts on that? Like, not the ethical side of it or the copying side of it, or even whether she did or she didn't. Have you uncovered actual evidence that there was some legal, like what I'd heard is that they had threatened her. They didn't sue her, but they threatened her with a lawsuit if she didn't take it off the shelves. So, Tom, just let Steve explain if he's uncovered actual evidence that is true.
Yeah, it was a threat. It wasn't an actual lawsuit or any kind of conviction or anything like that.
Have you found that in writing somewhere?
Yes, and Daniels himself talks about this, like you say, Daniels was a friend of Ellen White. He had no reason to be attacking her. He's very candid about the problem with that book. And you yourself said you've read both copies, and it's obvious that, to try to justify plagiarism is a pretty sad thing. And, even if
it's not plagiarism, it's not. It's just, you just say you're calling it that, but it's not that.
That's what you want to
argue.
argue.
Says it's that way. It's not that way.
But Steve, are you saying there's actual written evidence of them writing that to her?
Many legal scholars who say she was absolutely guilty of plagiarism.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true.
It's 100%.
Legal scholars I read say she wasn't.
Back to Steve. Is there an actual document uncovered where they've written to her saying cease and desist?
I haven't seen it. If it exists,
because it doesn't exist. It's made up. I've got letters.
Daniels confirms it. What would Daniels have against
Daniels? Daniels is talking about memory 30 years ago. Is there any proof? And the fact of the matter is, I've got 2 letters from the Coney Barron Howe publisher saying it never happened. It never happened. The
You got
publisher
proof
saying that.
100
What the
years
hell's the
later,
matter
or
with
what?
you? Making this stuff up. It's ridiculous.
But if you're
You go,
saying
you put in your
A.G.
book.
Daniels is relying on 30 years of memory, they're relying on over 100 years memory. Why
Yeah,
would you
and we're
trust
relying
them
on
more?
facts. We need facts. So you don't write a book, Steve, and say she was guilty of lawsuits. She was guilty of all that, and they don't. And it's not that you have no proof.
Now
I
we're
have-
looking. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I have one of the most documented books you're going to read. So, you know, people can
Give me a
read
break.
the
Give me a break.
documentation and make up their own mind. I don't
Yeah,
care what
fine.
you think.
Read my sources and make up your own mind. That's
You
right.
have your own agenda, so I'm not.
I
worried
have my
about
agenda to tell the truth. That's right. That's my
It's
agenda.
not the truth.
Now we're looking
Yeah.
forward to your book coming out, Tom. Make sure you do publish it so that we can actually buy it, and we're going to have a part 2, I think, one day where your book's out and Steve's had a bit of a read. Now we're going to move on because we're going to run out of time soon. These are just a couple of comments here. One of you might have 2 devices on. If you've got 2 on, just turn one of them off. David Koresh referred to himself as the sinful Messiah. You have to admit it's a good gig. I think we'll just take that as a comment. Here's one for Steve. Excuse me. Can Steve comment on Ellen G. White having visions from God about Christ's return in 1847, 1852? I think it was 1851, wasn't it? And on 2 other occasions. What are the sources of that? To me, and I've said this to you before, Steve, Adventism, if Christ had come back 7 years after 1844, that's 1851, isn't it? The Adventism would have been proved absolutely perfectly true and accurate. It's because to me that not coming true is a big one for me, because it suddenly meant that Adventists had to kind of spend the rest of their existence trying to fit that round peg into a square hole. But share us your thoughts on that vision from God about the return.
There's so much here that it's hard to be concise, but she starts out in her when she's 17 years old with her first vision, claiming that God gave her the day and hour of his second coming right in that first vision, which is a total lie. And then her best friend, Lucinda Burdick, who's traveling with her, leaves her and says, this woman is constantly claiming God showing her stuff about his return that never came true, again and again and again. Then of course you have Bates coming up with the 7-year theory, and she embraces that and says there's only 3 months left, again, based on a vision. In 1856, she claims she sees a vision where people will be translated in that room. They all die, and she has no answer for it. It's just one thing after the next. She's claiming it's too late to get married. After
but then she gets married. She gets married.
Right, and then she gets
so,
married.
So why do you say, like, you act like she's don't get married? She got married. So she's changing, she's growing, she's learning. This is
after James died, many, many, many years later.
You think the Adventists went around teaching people not to get married?
If people would have taken her seriously, we wouldn't have a human race left. She's just claiming so much stuff from God that's complete nonsense that you have to really be naive to believe God's showing her all this stuff.
How did she pull this off? How could such an awful person develop a global religious empire? It's mind-boggling that you can be
very
so
easily,
stupid,
very easily. It's a very isolated subculture.
Go ahead, you do it. Go ahead. You go.
I don't want to do it. I don't want to be a cult leader.
Here's someone that's written, she's not the first to build up an empire and still be a big-time fraud. We choose and filter through the word of God. She got the word wrong on many, many occasions with a list of E.G. White contradictions that disqualify her.
Contradictions don't make you a fraud. That's the thing here. Contradictions don't nullify the spirit of God.
Claiming what she claimed makes her a fraud. That's the
No,
bottom
you're
line.
misreading her claims. You're embellishing them. You're taking them out of
I'm not
context.
they're
Who are
her
you kidding?
exact quotes. I mean, come
Exact
on.
quote. Yeah, she had an exact quote too. We shouldn't get married because the second coming is going to happen. Well, she was 19 years old when she said that or whatever. She realized that wasn't right and she got married. So don't go around to, oh, she's so stupid. She said that. She was a young.
She did the
Spiritual gifts
same
or not,
thing.
you're going to get stuff wrong. That
1880.
doesn't mean she's a fraud.
She did
That's
Now-
the
ridiculous.
thing in the
Ridiculous.
1880s after James died, claiming God showed her this in vision. Come on. I mean,
you
are
know,
you
I don't. You have to read what she says in context. If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Doesn't mean she's a fraud.
Yeah,
Now,
he's
You
here's-
wrong.
can't produce all the fruit she has and be a fraud. I'm
Here's
sorry.
one for Tom. Do you have to be an Adventist to be saved, Tom?
Absolutely not. I mean, whoever heard of such a thing? God's not an Adventist. Jesus is not an Adventist. So, no, not at all. But you do have to understand the gospel. That's more difficult than understanding Adventism.
Someone else has said you can't excuse everything she said and did. She was a hypocrite about her own health message. But I think, Tom, you're saying that even hypocrites can have inspirational
Of course. I mean,
tendencies.
again, you got to get off of this perfection. Okay, we'll listen to her. Makes a mistake, she's awful. It's just not how life works. She lived a long time. What she wrote and said and when she was 17 is going to be different than when she's 27, and then when she's 37 and 47 and 57 and 67 and 77. You can't take these quotes out of context and then slap her with them and say, what kind of idiot woman are you? People grow, they learn.
Now, we've got a huge audience today on both YouTube and Facebook. I want to encourage everybody, please press that like button if you're on Facebook. It helps the algorithms to really spread the word, and particularly on YouTube, if you subscribe. We hit 500 subscribers the other day. We need to hit 1,000 by Christmas. So click subscribe and like. This is Claire from YouTube. The investigative judgment and Ellen White stand and fall together. Pretty sure she said something like that herself. Thoughts,
Absolutely
Tom?
not.
Tom
Not.
first.
I mean, the right wing of Adventism has claimed that for her, but that is not true. And in fact, investigative judgment is not even a pillar in the three angels' messages. And more specifically, the hour of his judgment has come in Revelation 14:7 is only a reference to the second coming. It never was a reference to the investigative judgment. And when the Tacoma Park apologists started teaching that was the end of Adventism. You know, when you change the three angels' messages in such a dramatic way, you ruin it. So everybody thinks the investigative judgment is in the first angel's message and that Ellen White said you can't change it, but it never was. Only the second coming. The hour of judgment has come was something Miller said about the second coming. You can't go back and change that and insert the investigative judgment there. But that's what has happened, and it's destroyed Adventism.
Tom, when I interviewed you last time, and I think it was me, or we may have both agreed that there are a lot of people that agree with you in this kind of little subsidiary form of Adventism. Have you found in the last couple of years a growing movement that are gathering together in online groups or face-to-face that agree with you and are kind of building up a bit of a community?
You know, I haven't had an active website for a number of years. I can tell you this, a lot of people in Adventism are not happy with it. They're not as unhappy as Steve, but they're, you know, Ellen White's credibility right now is at, I don't know if it's a zero, but it's pretty close to it. It's a catastrophe what's happening. And the problem with Ellen White is if you defame her and slander her and don't pay attention to her, you'll never get anything. You'll never learn any eschatology. You'll never improve Adventism because she is a founder. And as a founder, she knows how this thing was put together and what's important and what's not. And to her, the three angels' messages is what it was all about. And she never changed that. So, and she said, look, you're going to learn new stuff. You're going to unlearn stuff. Whatever we've said in the past, it doesn't matter. It matters what is truth and what the Bible teaches, blah, blah, blah. And she did say, I think this is what the lady's talking about, that we can never remove the pillars and they have to stand and all that. But then people misunderstand the pillars. They think the investigative judgment is a pillar in the first angel's message. That's what everybody ended up saying in the 70s. Well, it never was in the first angel's message, and it's not a pillar. And investigative judgment is a false, wrong, incorrect, diversionary doctrine. And unless it gets removed and repudiated, Adventism cannot focus on the second coming, the time of trouble, the stuff they need to be paying attention to.
Someone has written Adventism is a false gospel. What truth needs to be uncovered or restored? You can't fix a mistake by living in it. Do you think that by staying within the Adventist Church, Tom, you can bring about this kind of change and new awareness, a waking up that needs to?
Well, I don't know. I don't go to church. I don't pay tithe. Tithe is a false doctrine. I would never do it. I've grown out of that. So I don't go to church. I cannot support it because they teach so many absolutely horrible doctrines, including the investigative judgment. There's no such doctrine, and they don't teach the gospel correctly. So, Dr. Ford does. I mean, if it wasn't for Dr. Ford, I think I probably would have given up altogether on Adventism. But he is such a positive, gospel-oriented person, and he thought Adventism was raised up by God. He thought Ellen White was legitimate, and I'll document that in the next section of the book. So Stephen, you're arguing against me about Ellen White. You're arguing against Dr. Ford. Des Ford loves Ellen White, supports Ellen White, defends Ellen White, knows how to articulate her without going down these rabbit holes of, she became an alcoholic and she did this when she was 17 and she tripped over something. That's nonsense. So I support Dr. Ford's view of Ellen White 100%, as well as his view about the three angels' messages and Adventism. There's a lot of good in Adventism. The fact that they have an incorrect gospel and incorrect judgment is horrible. They need to get the right gospel, the correct judgment, which is the second coming, and move this thing forward to the fourth angel's message.
Yeah,
where you will get correct doctrines about the Sabbath and everything else, hopefully.
Steve, any thoughts?
Ford certainly didn't agree with Ellen White on a lot of her eschatology, and especially the investigative judgment.
Of course not, but he believed in her.
What she says in Spiritual Gifts 1, page 162, 197, 198, she completely claims to confirm the investigative judgment through vision. She does the same thing in the Spirit of Prophecy, volume 4, page 266.
Dr. Ford would laugh at you. You don't think Dr. Ford knows that? You don't think Dr. Ford's read those things?
But you're the one saying Ellen White didn't claim to see the investigative judgment in vision, but it's complete bogus.
I didn't say that. I said it's not a fundamental doctrine. It's not a pillar in the three angels' messages. That's what I said.
She claimed God showed it to her in vision.
Fine. Maybe she thought he did. Maybe he did. That's not for me to tell. No.
She thought he showed her a lot of things that he didn't show her. That's my point.
Well, that's the way it goes. You don't get a perfect prophet. You don't get a prophet that's going to tell you the lottery numbers. You get what you get. And we're lucky we got what we got, because you wouldn't have Seventh-day Adventism without Ellen White. You would not have.
You seem to think eschatology is Adventism saving grace. It's one of the worst things about Adventism.
Well, it's the point of Adventism. It's the point of Adventism.
It's about legalism, perfectionism, the time of trouble, Sunday laws, all of
it doesn't have to be legalism. It doesn't have to be legalism. You mean the people, if you think the second coming is close, you mean you're a legalist? That can't be true.
The reason Adventists are so messed up is Ellen White's visions. That's the reason.
No, they're so messed up. Well, how is the rest of the world messed up? Is it because of Ellen White? Are the Baptists messed up because of Ellen White? Are the Catholics messed up because of Ellen White? Is the world messed up because of Ellen White? You blame her for everything. It's absurd.
Now let's keep moving on. Someone else just gave another plug for Test the Prophet. Have you seen that website, Tom? It's a really good one. What about you, Steve?
I've seen something there where a guy with a really important voice is going over the Coney Barron housing thing and just repeating all these myths that are out there.
Here's one for Steve. It's a joke, though, I've realised. Steve, did Ellen make any diary references to mushrooms? And put kidding. We can laugh at that. Someone else said, actually, I'm interested in, I've read somewhere, Steve, you comment on this. She also got paid by the SA Church, so why wouldn't she want it to thrive? Just out of interest, Steve or Tom, did she do quite well financially from her royalties of the books? How was that split with the church? Was it like a 50-50 split, or did she take all the royalties?
She
Did
got
she
a royalty of I think it was 15%, and then they knocked it down when she was in Australia. They in Battle Creek, they knocked it down to like 10% so they could double their salaries, and they doubled their salaries and cut her money down, and she got really mad, and but that's
her
made money off his books too.
Her house here in Kurrambong, literally, I could walk there in 5 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. It's a beautiful house. Like when she was here, you can still see houses that were around in the day when she was here, and hers is a mansion compared to even a lot of houses that are still in old Kurrambong.
And
So she
running
did well.
She's running an empire. She has a staff of people. Her house was like a headquarters. People were coming and going. It wasn't just a house, and she sits back and
we don't begrudge people's success. I'd like a big house.
Yeah. Hey, I live in a big house, you know?
Speaking of Test the Prophet, they've just written People on Saturn is based on the Bible. That's that next part of that vision with her and Joseph Bates and seeing the moons. She then went on to say there were people living there. Why do you think she added that? Because that wasn't necessarily something Joseph needed to hear.
You know, if people were so weird back in that day, I mean, you know, their lives and their thoughts and their knowledge and their information base is nothing like ours. I mean, it's you really have to be careful when you try to get in these people's heads that live so in a different world. They're in a different world. And obviously, if she said stuff that was wrong, it's wrong. So what? Peter said stuff that was wrong too. So what? In fact, Peter got in a big fight. That's what you see in Galatians. Paul standing up to him and cussing him out. You did this, blah, blah, blah. You did this. You're a bad person, Peter. So what do we do? Now, Peter, why don't you, that's all right about Peter, and rip out his book and say he's a fraud. Because he was
maybe Paul was a fraud.
Well, there you go. And if you go down this rabbit hole like this, you can start at Genesis. The first 3 chapters of Genesis contains 2 different creation stories where the things happened on different days. There's obviously 2 different writers there, and scholars have known that for years. But the beginning of the Bible has problems.
Now,
does that mean that the Spirit wasn't involved with it? Well, if you take the position of Ellen White that you're taking, then it's all wrong. Just throw the thing in the trash. There's errors all over it. Errors, clear errors.
Now, this is for Tom. Tom said the Ellen White estate placed Ellen White on such a high pedestal. Why then does the SDA Church still hold to the belief that her writings, even the mistakes as he called them, speak with prophetic authority as a fundamental belief? And B, why shouldn't the church jettison her writings en masse to avoid all the mistakes, theological error, and focus on scripture?
That is a very good question. And here's the answer. In Battle Creek, when Ellen White was alive and had something to say about how the church did things, she would not allow them to use her writings in the Sabbath school lessons. She would not allow a pastor giving a sermon to all of a sudden say, and Ellen White says on page so-and-so, the Great Controversy. The pastors went to her and said, look, I had this sermon and I really want to use this quote of yours. And she said, forget about it. That's not what we do. You do use the Bible only. Over and over. That was the position. Well, fast forward to Tacoma Park. Whoa, here's the pedestal. All of a sudden, Ellen White's in the Sabbath school lessons. Every sermon is 50% Ellen White. The sermons are Ellen White sermons. The pastors are so lazy, they're just reading Ellen White. That's a complete putting her up on a pedestal. She would never have allowed it when she was alive, and they should never have done it in Tacoma Park. And then they did it, and they said, we're going to use her. You know, you have a problem about the wedding ring or whatever, we'll go into the vault, we'll cook up some stuff we think she says that we agree with, and we'll tell you what Ellen White thinks about the wedding ring and this and that. And so they were using, and they do it well, now they don't do as much because no one likes Ellen White. And so they wanted to use Ellen White as their sock puppet to manipulate the church. That's why they did it, and they do it today. The Sabbath school lessons are full of Ellen White. It's wrong to do. Ellen White never approved it. It's completely wrong. And why do they want to say Ellen White should be followed? Because they're in control of her. They're manipulating her to say what they want to hear. So that's why they hold her up. If they told the truth about Ellen White, they would have to condemn themselves because they're not following the real Ellen White. This is what I'm so upset about. I've been in the White estate and archives for 2 years solid, 40, 50 hours a week, Steve. Every day I take my little lunch, go in and work with Bert Holoviak, and sometimes I work with Ron Graybill. So you can ask him about it. And I got into some heavy stuff there. I've read hundreds and hundreds of Ellen White's original documents, and by now more than that. So this thing is not being, the White estate has not been honest about Ellen White. They're still not being honest about Ellen White. So when they say, listen to Ellen White,
what was that, Steve?
I said, can I get in a word edgewise?
Far away, Steve.
Tom keeps saying, how could she build up this empire? It's very simple. When you claim
it's
false,
so simple, you do it.
When you claim, I don't want to do it. I don't want to be a cult leader.
You don't want to help the world and build hospitals and schools for the world.
When you claim false visions, and then you surround yourselves by people who want to be special, you're the remnant. You're the true church. Everyone else is false. Everyone else is.
And you think that's going to build hospitals around the world?
Yes, it will. Look at the Revelation seminars. You're the true remnant. You're the true people of God. You're the ones who have the truth. There's a lot of people who want to hear this stuff. And when you claim to have these visions from God that prove to them that they are these people, it's a formula for building up a false church, which is
maybe in your mind, that's just your opinion. One of her visions, which I put in my report, has come true. She's got visions that have come true.
One vision. What is that?
The one about where she tells to James White, go publish a paper, and it's going to be or go around the world and be a global empire one day, blah, blah. And he starts, and it ended up being that. I mean, that's what's, it's so clear. It's so, you can't miss that if you wanted to.
Out of thousands of claimed visions, you're saying there's one that was true. But,
well, she's got more. She's got more, but it's not my job to say how many she got right and how many she got wrong. That's playing that game of test the prophets. Is she right? Is she wrong? What's her score? What's her batting average? We're not playing batting average. The White estate can play that. That's okay. That's not necessary.
I'm wanting to wrap up in about 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just do some fast, high-powered bringing up to the screen some of these comments. And look, thanks again, both of you, for being on the program. Tom, I think you need to start your own movement, and I'd be fascinated to see, because I know a lot of people do agree with you. Okay, quick one for Tom. Can Tom briefly explain his understanding of the three angels message? It doesn't seem to gel with traditional Adventism.
Where it doesn't gel is that most Adventists today think that the hour of his judgment has come in Revelation 14:7 is a reference to the investigative judgment. That's what Adventism has. They've been teaching that since, 1950s, 60s. That's why Dr. Ford had such a hard time. They said to him, you can't change investigative judgment. You can't touch it. It's a pillar. But of course, Dr. Ford showed them the definition of the three angels' messages in his book. And lo and behold, the first angel's message, the judgment in that, he said correctly, is the second coming. Investigative judgment wasn't even invented at the time of the first angel's message. So it could never be there. And of course, Ellen White says you can never change any of the pillars in the three angels' messages. Well, in the 70s, people said that means investigative judgment. Well, it never did. That's a complete, utter nonsense, incorrect view of Ellen White and Adventist history and theology. So that's probably what she's referring to. Now, when it comes to the third angel's message, which is the Seventh-day Adventist, the main pillar there is the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath. It's not fully correct and needs further work. Jesus did not teach the fourth commandment. In fact, I can tell you this, Peter. One time I was having a discussion with Dr. Ford. We were talking about the law, and he looked at me and he said, "I have never been able to find Jesus teaching the fourth commandment." And I just thought that was I never even thought of such a thing. I mean, of course he did. He's all over, the Sabbath, Jesus going to Sabbath, whatever. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on there, but he's right. First of all, the seventh-day Sabbath, you can have seventh-day Sabbath, but it doesn't have to be the fourth commandment. It's not based on the fourth commandment. It's not based on the law. We're not trying to keep the 10 commandments, number one, and we weren't given those. Those were given to the Jews. So Sabbath reform is not complete. Adventists need to push it forward and understand the seventh-day gospel Sabbath of Christ, not the old covenant Sabbath of Moses. And Canright was close to this. He got close to it. And in his early writings, when he was fighting against the Sabbath, he understood that the law of Christ was trumped the law of Moses. But then he went on and said, and so now that's why we have to go to embrace the Lord's Day on Sunday. Jesus never embraced the Lord's Day on Sunday. So the Sabbath that Jesus followed in the New Testament is the Sabbath doctrine that Seventh-day Adventists have to embrace. What they have now is wrong.
I'll agree with that part, at least.
There you go. All right.
We found some common ground.
All right.
Hey, Steve.
In the state of the dead. There's two things we agree on right there.
That's good. We're finding common
making
ground.
progress. Absolutely.
Now, talking about common ground, Steve, just as I think of it, was it which Thompson disagreed with you and you had a bit of a back and forth?
Oh, yeah. Thompson up in Walla Walla.
Was that Eldon or Eldon?
Eldon Thompson.
Be great to have him on the show at some point. I might reach out to him. He has more of a traditional view of Adventism. Be interesting
I'd
to
like
see.
any of these Adventist scholars to come on with me. None of them are willing because they know I've got the evidence.
Now, Ellen G. White.
That's funny.
Hang on a second, Tom. Ellen G. White and James were conniving and great salesmen. Their marketing scheme was excellent Ponzi scheme. Do you take it that far, Steve? The fraud was such a planned Ponzi scheme almost?
No, I mean, I wouldn't call it a Ponzi scheme, but there's no question that they benefited tremendously financially. They lived at a very lavish lifestyle level. They made a lot of money. They financially exploited church members through visions. It's a pretty tragic thing. And when we talk about people wanting to hear how special they are to join, the other side of that coin is if you dared to question her visions, she destroys you. And there's just repeated evidence of her destroying people who dared to question her vision. So Tom doesn't seem to want to address that, but it's very true.
Now, Tom, I might just get you to turn your mic down a little bit, your speaker mic. That's why we're getting a bit of the echo there. Now, don't answer this one. I think I know what you're going to say already. Did she not have a vision confirmed in the investigative judgment? If the IJ is not true, then she did not have a vision, and all the rest of her visions come into question. And I think, Tom, you would just say, well, she just got it wrong.
I don't know what vision she's talking about. So, I mean,
the investigative judgment confirming that it was true.
I already referred to 3 of the visions there that I gave you the references for.
Yeah, I'm sure she did at some point. They all did. They all thought, even without visions, they thought it was true. You didn't have to have a vision to think the investigative judgment was true. Uriah Smith had no visions, and he was there, a big scholar, and he wrote a book on it, and he was certain it was true. So he wasn't saying that because he thought Ellen White's vision made it true. He thought about it and said, this is how it works. They all thought that's how it worked.
Is Tom Norris
Eschatology is difficult.
a former
Eschatology is not easy.
Is Tom Norris a former SDA?
Tom Norris was raised as an SDA, born on October 22nd. How about that for a birthday? And
you were born October
my
22nd.
membership is with the Capital Memorial Church. But Adventism has so many errors and stuff. I can't support what they're doing. I can't.
Someone else will
and
just take.
I wouldn't recommend anyone to join the Adventist Church. They're so confused and convoluted. Why would anyone want to join that mess? They don't even understand the gospel right. They don't even understand the Sabbath right.
Does Tom believe that Ellen White wrote any truth? The more I understand of his beliefs, the harder I find it to understand why he is so strong on defending Ellen White.
Ellen White wrote a lot of truth. The Three Angels' Messages is a eschatological paradigm for the end of the world. That's where the truth resides.
There's some questions on your thoughts on the Sabbath. We'll leave those. Go into the group later and have fun answering some of these questions as well, gentlemen. Here's one. How can you believe in a prophet who believes in a doctrine of atonement that is different than yours?
What was that? Was there a question for me?
How can you believe in a prophet who believes in a doctrine of atonement that is different than yours?
Well, the prophet that I'm, quote, believing in, and believing in, I don't know if that's the right word, Ellen White understood the gospel. She finally got it. After 1888, she got it. And if it wasn't for Ellen White, no Adventist, there wouldn't even have been an 1888 debate, much less the word righteousness by faith. Ellen White is a gospel hero, and that has been covered up by the White estate because they all were a bunch of legalists over there. They all were following Uriah Smith and his theology, and they told everybody that it was Ellen White's theology and that she agreed with him when the opposite was true. She fired Uriah Smith in 1902. He was thrown out of the review because he refused to embrace the 1888 theology. Most people don't know that. The church has covered that up. Steve talks about cover-ups. Uriah Smith was thrown out of the review. He was thrown out because he wouldn't believe the 1888 message. Yet in Tacoma Park, the apologists taught 1888, everybody agreed with it. Uriah Smith finally came around and became friends with Ellen White. Never happened. And then the White estate went on to promote Uriah Smith's theology and claimed it was Ellen White's. Now, that's what's happened. And they've yet to confess it, much less undo it.
Make sure in your book, Tom, add your experiences at Tacoma Park. Now, we're going to wrap it up. I've just got this one here for Steve. Oh, there's some fantastic questions. I can't believe it. Like, there's literally at least another 50 questions. You guys are going to have to go and look these up and get into conversation there. We've never had such amount of questions and views. It's great to see. Even more than the George Knight interview. Wow. So, Peter, if you had time at the end, could you ask Steve to clarify a comment last time he was here about the Maxwellian view, saying that it says the crucifixion wasn't needed? That's entirely, was there more there?
Saying opposite, entirely
that's
opposite.
Entirely opposite.
The class I took from Graham Maxwell, he was emphasizing the moral influence theory and that it's all about God's love. And he was minimizing the Fordian Ford's view that, the atonement was paying the ransom for sin. And that's pretty common knowledge that Maxwell and Ford weren't on the same page. And the moral influence theory just basically says Jesus died to demonstrate God's love, but he didn't have to die. whereas that's very different from the New Testament view that Jesus died for our sins and that atonement was absolutely necessary, which is where I'm coming from. The perfect finished work of Christ is something I preach constantly and emphasize constantly. And so I didn't really agree with Maxwell and talk to him about it in the class. But, it's obvious that people have different views of the atonement.
Okay, gentlemen, we will wrap it up. Tom, you've got 2 minutes to summarize your thoughts, and then Steve will give you the last word there.
Well, the summary that I would say is we really need to see a lot of this stuff in writing. So I hope you can post up that 70-page report, Peter. Because it's just too hard when people say X and someone says Y and all that kind of stuff. There's so much. Ellen White lived so long. There's so many documents. It's really very unfair to try to pick out a document here and there, pick out a statement here and there. One when she's 17, another when she's 30, another when she's 80, and act like it's all, this makes sense or doesn't make sense. It's just there's too much stuff. And too many things can be said. So rather than people need to read what I've written and read what Steve has written. Compare the two things. I'll finish up, and at some point, everything that I've been saying will be written and documented. And people, like Steve says, they can choose what to believe one way or another. The good news is, I would say first of all that I'm happy that Steve wrote his book. A lot of people aren't, but there's a problem with Adventism. It's not the problem that Steve says it is, but Adventism has a serious problem about Ellen White, and it needs to be addressed and it needs to be fixed. And I'm glad that Steve and I agreed on the state of the dead, that was a good doctrine, and that the gospel Sabbath, Seventh-day gospel Sabbath, is a good idea. So we are agreed on 2 points, and there's not that many left to go. So I think once Steve reads what my sources are, he's going to have to make some adjustments because his sources are not going to make it. But anyway, I enjoyed this, Steve, and if we can agree on those two things, we can agree on some more things in the future. So.
Thanks very much, Tom. And Steve, a couple of minutes with some closing thoughts.
Just to clarify, I don't accept the Adventist state of the dead doctrine. I do agree that God doesn't torture the wicked throughout eternity, very definitely. But, I've written a book that I put my heart and soul into in terms of documentation. It's source documentation from Ellen's own pen. There are 326 extensive references for people to study for themselves. Interpret it for yourself. That's what I say. Tom didn't have his document ready, so I've had no opportunity to look at whatever references he's going to appeal to. I'll be glad to do that and see what I think of them. But, I have a hard time with someone who says, Ellen claimed God showed her all this stuff, and she was wrong much of the time, but we still need to accept her as a true prophet. To me, that's a joke. She was wrong a lot. She hurt a lot of people in God's name. She committed blasphemy, as far as I'm concerned, and it's all documented. And I just encourage people to read for themselves and decide for themselves.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate both of you taking your time to spend here with us at SDAQ&A, and very much value your contribution. And we can agree to disagree, or we can find common ground. But either way, what an amazing conversation. Please go and continue the conversation if you like over there on YouTube and Facebook. And once again, everyone, we look forward to seeing you next time. We've got Gillian Ford coming on with an interview very soon, actually. She will be joining me, I think, next week So we're going to be having another chat a little bit about her views on Glacier View. And don't forget, I'm offering this free song. Just go to peterdixon.gumroad.com. Thanks for everyone's support. And until next time, this is me
Thank you,
signing
Peter.
off.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Steve.
Peter.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
God bless.